at the western edge of Luxor, where the desert folds into dry valleys and the cliffs hold heat long after sunset, a tomb waits in silence beneath the broken limestone. It is not the first tomb found in Egypt, not the richest, not the most glittering, and not the one tourists have whispered about for a century. Yet in 2025, this damaged chamber in Wadi C becomes something far more haunting than a treasure room. It becomes a reminder that the age of the pharaohs has never truly ended. It has only been buried, flooded, sealed, robbed, misread, forgotten, and then, from time to time, allowed to speak again. The tomb is known as C4, a plain archaeological label for a place once meant to hold a divine king. For years, it sits as a question in the landscape west of Luxor, part of the vast funerary world surrounding ancient Thebes. The stone is scarred, the burial is disturbed, the body is gone. Floods have torn through the tomb in antiquity, damaging walls, shifting debris, and leaving behind the kind of archaeological confusion that makes certainty slow and fragile. But then the details begin to gather into a pattern. On the walls survive scenes from the Amduat, the great underworld text that guided the sun god through the 12 hours of night. Above, traces of a blue and yellow starry ceiling suggest a royal afterlife, a sky recreated underground. And in those remnants, scholars recognize the outline of a lost king's resting place, Pharaoh Thutmose II, husband of Hatshepsut, father of Thutmose III, a ruler long overshadowed by the giants who came before and after him. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the strange power of this story lies not only in what the tomb reveals, but in what it refuses to give back. The discovery does not offer a golden mask like Tutankhamun. It does not open into a room stacked with chariots, shrines, and dazzling objects. Instead, it offers absence, a tomb without its king, a royal burial interrupted by disaster. A sacred place where the original plan seems to have failed, and where the dead pharaoh may have been moved elsewhere by ancient hands trying to save what remained of his eternity. This is how the story of Egypt's pharaohs often reaches the present not as a complete scroll unrolled on a table, but as fragments rescued from dust, water, politics, tomb robbers, and time. The evidence remains incomplete. A ceiling survives where a coffin does not. A passage holds religious scenes while the burial chamber has lost its central presence. A name is recovered not because the past remained whole, but because enough pieces escape destruction to make the silence legible. And that is why the identification of Thutmose II's tomb matters so deeply. It is not simply another entry in the catalogue of royal burials. It is the first confirmed discovery of a pharaonic royal tomb of this kind since the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, and it appears at a moment when many people assume ancient Egypt has already surrendered its greatest secrets. The desert disagrees. To stand in that landscape, even in imagination, is to feel the architecture of a royal memory stretched across miles of stone. The Nile lies to the east, green and living, a ribbon of cultivation that has fed Egypt since before there were pharaohs. Beyond it rise temples, pylons, ruined courts, and the ghostly outlines of ancient processions. To the west, the land hardens into necropolis. The sun drops behind cliffs that glow red, then purple, then grey. In these western valleys, kings tried to hide themselves from the world while building monuments to their own immortality. They wanted secrecy and eternity at the same time, a combination that has kept archaeologists busy and occasionally exasperated. Thutmose II belongs to the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful royal families in Egyptian history. Yet he is not remembered with the clarity of Hatshepsut, the royal woman who became king, or Thutmose III, the warrior ruler who expanded Egypt's empire. His reign seems comparatively brief. His surviving monuments are limited. His historical presence is partly defined by those around him, which is a very human fate for someone once treated as divine. Scholars still debate the details of his reign, his health, his authority, and the political arrangements that followed his death. What survives in the record suggests a king whose life was important not because he dominated the age, but because his death stood at the doorway of one of Egypt's most fascinating transitions. That doorway is exactly what makes his tomb so compelling. If Hatshepsut played a role in the burial arrangements, as the evidence suggests, then the tomb becomes more than a resting place. It becomes a political and religious stage at a delicate moment in royal succession. A king has died. A young heir exists. A powerful royal woman stands near the center of authority. Priests, officials, embalmers, artists, quarrymen, and guards move through a world where every gesture around the dead carries meaning. The deceased pharaoh must be transformed into an eternal being. The living court must remain stable. The gods must be satisfied. The image of order must survive, even if uncertainty moves quietly beneath it. Then water comes. It is easy to imagine ancient Egypt as dry beyond measure, a civilization preserved by desert air. But the tombs of the Western Wadis tell a more complicated story. Sudden floods can rush through dry channels with destructive force, turning narrow valleys into violent paths of mud and stone. A tomb built for eternity can be damaged by a moment of weather. In the case of Thutmose II, flood evidence suggests the original burial place may have become unsafe or unusable, perhaps forcing ancient Egyptians to move the royal body and precious funerary equipment elsewhere. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, but the possibility is powerful. The king's afterlife, so carefully planned, may have been rescued from his own tomb. That image changes the mood of the entire discovery. Instead of a sealed royal chamber waiting patiently for modern excavation, there is a crisis in the ancient past. There are workers entering a damaged tomb. There are priests concerned with ritual purity. There are officials responsible for protecting a divine corpse. There is a decision, practical and sacred at once, to move what can be moved. The pharaoh, who in life stood as the human point between gods and Egypt, becomes vulnerable in death to mud, water, theft, and memory. Even kings of the two lands depend on others to carry them into eternity. The tomb's Amduat scenes deepen that irony. The Amduat is a map of night, a sacred journey through the underworld in which the sun god travels by boat through darkness, before rising again in the east. For a pharaoh, these images are not decoration in the modern sense. They are protection, instruction, cosmic machinery. They place the dead king inside the nightly rebirth of the sun. They promise that darkness is not the end, that the hidden world has gates, hours, guardians, and a path through terror into renewal. Beneath a painted starry sky, the king is meant to join a cycle older than dynasties. Yet the tomb itself shows that even sacred machinery can be broken by earthly forces. This tension runs through the entire history of the pharaohs. They are presented as divine, but they age. They command armies, but they cannot command the Nile forever. They build pyramids, temples, obelisks, and hidden tombs, but their names can still be chiseled away, their bodies moved, their monuments reused, their stories misunderstood. They rule as symbols of cosmic order, yet their world is full of disorder succession struggles, droughts, foreign invasions, religious experiments, ambitious officials, tomb robberies, and the slow erosion of stone under wind and human hands. And still they endure. They endure in fragments of bone and linen, in boat pits and quarry marks, in statues with broken noses, in gold masks and mud brick towns, in temple reliefs where enemies are eternally defeated even when history was less tidy. They endure in the careful work of archaeologists reading damage as evidence, absence as clue, and silence as a kind of testimony. The pharaohs survive not because they achieved perfect immortality, but because their civilization left behind enough traces for each generation to meet them again in a different way. The tomb of Thutmose II is therefore not merely a beginning because it is recent. It is a beginning because it captures the whole Egyptian mystery in miniature. A king is hidden in the west. His tomb is royal but wounded. The art speaks of cosmic rebirth. The body is missing. The landscape remembers what the archive cannot fully explain. Modern science arrives with cameras, conservation tools, inscriptions, comparative knowledge, and cautious excitement, only to find that the ancient dead still control part of the story. From this damaged chamber, the path leads backward, long before Thutmose II, before Thebes became an imperial capital, before the Valley of the Kings became a royal cemetery, before pyramids rose at Giza, before even the word pharaoh carried the weight it later would. To understand why a flooded tomb in Luxor can still matter after more than 3,000 years, the story must return to the earliest kings, to a time when Egypt was not yet the Egypt of colossal statues and golden burials, but a river world learning how to turn death, power, and landscape into something that looked eternal. From the wounded tomb of Thutmose II, the story turns backward along the Nile, away from the hidden valleys of New Kingdom Thebes and into a much older Egypt, an Egypt before the Valley of the Kings, before the Great Pyramids, before painted underworld books covered royal walls, and before the word Pharaoh had fully gathered its later majesty. The river is still there, of course. It is always there, long before a king's name can be written inside a cartouche. The Nile already divides the world into opposites that feel almost sacred: black soil and red desert, flood and drought, life and death, east and west. On its banks, communities farm, herd, trade, bury their dead, and watch the seasons repeat with a force that must have seemed both generous and terrifying. Egypt is not yet an empire of temples and obelisks. It is a landscape slowly teaching human beings how power can be made visible. In these early centuries, authority does not appear all at once wearing a crown. It gathers. It gathers around fertile land, around storage, around river movement, around ritual specialists, around families able to command labor, exchange goods, and turn burial into display. Long before the pyramids rise at Saqqara and Giza, some graves already begin to separate certain people from others. They are deeper, more carefully built, more richly supplied. Their bodies are placed with pottery, stone vessels, ornaments, tools, and objects that suggest rank, memory, and a belief that death is not simply disappearance. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how early Egyptian kingship emerged from these regional cultures. But what survives in the record suggests a slow tightening of social hierarchy along the Nile. The recent reports of nearly 5,000-year-old tombs at Jebel al-Tair in Minya fit into this deeper beginning. They do not belong to the familiar world of Khufu or Tutankhamun. They belong to the early dynastic horizon, when Egyptian royal and elite burial traditions are still taking shape. Their importance lies not in golden spectacle, but in architecture, location, and timing. They may help illuminate how tomb design developed before the pyramid became the supreme royal form. That makes them quietly powerful. A tomb does not need treasure to matter. Sometimes a wall, a chamber, a shaft, or the way a grave is arranged can reveal a civilization learning how to imagine eternity. This early Egypt is a world of mud brick, reed, wood, clay, ivory, stone, and desert silence. The monumental stone architecture of later centuries has not yet fully arrived. So much of the first royal imagination is built from humbler materials. Mud brick tombs, especially at places like Abydos and Saqqara, can still be imposing, but they speak in a different language than the pyramids. They are not mountains yet. They are enclosures, chambers, storage places for the dead, symbolic houses for those whose authority extends beyond life. Some early elite burials include subsidiary graves and ritual spaces, reminders that power in this age could be severe and deeply unequal. In a calm retelling, it is enough to say that royal death was surrounded by dependence, offerings, and acts of state, and that the moral world of early kingship was very different from modern assumptions. What matters here is the pattern. Death becomes an arena where status is made permanent. The desert edge is crucial. Egyptians do not place their cemeteries randomly. The fertile floodplain is too precious for the dead, and the western desert carries a symbolism that grows stronger over time. The sun sets in the west. Light sinks into the horizon. The dead travel toward that fading glow, toward a realm that is invisible but not empty. Later Egyptians will fill this invisible world with elaborate texts and gods, but even in earlier periods, the geography already seems to invite sacred meaning. The living remain near the river and the fields. The dead rest where cultivation ends and timeless dryness begins. The border between black land and red land becomes a border between worlds. Here, long before pharaohs hide themselves in the Theban cliffs, the Egyptian elite begin to understand something profound about landscape. A grave can be more than a grave if it is placed correctly, built carefully, supplied richly, and remembered ritually. It can become a statement that the dead person belongs to an order larger than ordinary life. In that idea, one can glimpse the seed of royal immortality. The later pyramid is not an isolated miracle that appears out of nowhere. It is the grandest answer to a question Egypt has been asking for centuries. How can a human ruler become permanent in a world where flesh fails, floods change, and memory is fragile? The earliest rulers also learned to speak through symbols, crowns, standards, animals, ceremonial weapons, boats, and carved labels all help create a visual grammar of power. The falcon becomes increasingly important, especially in connection with Horus, the sky god whose watchful presence will become inseparable from kingship. A king is not merely a local chief with more grain. He's gradually presented as a cosmic figure, a person whose authority links earth and sky. The evidence for exactly when each belief took shape is uneven, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transformation from local leadership to divine kingship. But by the time Egypt enters the dynastic age, the ruler is already becoming something more than political. He's becoming necessary to the order of the world. That order depends on the Nile, but also on control over the Nile's gifts. Grain must be measured, fields must be organized after floods, labor must be mobilized, trade routes must be protected, stone, copper, timber, incense, and luxury goods move through networks that reach beyond any single village. In the early state, the ruler's power is not only sacred, it is administrative. This is one of the ancient Egypt's quieter surprises. Behind the later image of divine kings in gleaming crowns stands the patient machinery of counting, sealing, storing, and commanding, clay seal impressions, labels, jars, and tomb goods may seem less dramatic than a golden coffin, but they reveal the state being born in practical acts. The dead help build that state. Royal and elite tombs require planning, materials, workers, craft specialists, and ritual knowledge. They gather communities around a central project. They display access to goods from different regions. They turn political authority into a physical place people can see, visit, fear, serve, or remember. Before the pyramid, the tomb is already a machine of power. It says that some lives do not end in the ordinary way. It says that the ruler's household continues. It says that the social order should survive the body. And in Egypt, perhaps more than almost anywhere else in the ancient world, this claim becomes the foundation of civilization. At Jebel al-Tair, at Abydos, at Saqqara, and across the early cemeteries of the Nile Valley. The later pharaohs are being prepared before they exist in their most famous form. The tomb builders of these early generations do not know that one day a king named Djoser will rise above Saqqara in a stepped monument of stone. They do not know that Khufu's pyramid will dominate the Giza plateau like an artificial horizon. They do not know that thousands of years later, archaeologists will examine their burial chambers for clues to the birth of royal architecture. Yet their experiments matter because they create the habits of eternity. They teach Egypt that the ruler must be buried differently, remembered differently, and placed into a sacred landscape with care. So the complete story of Egypt's pharaohs does not begin with gold, or conquest, or even pyramids. It begins with the river and the grave. It begins with communities discovering that death can be organized into meaning, and meaning can be organized into authority. It begins in a world where the king is not yet the colossal figure later carved into temple walls, but where the conditions for that figure are already forming in mud brick, desert sand, ritual gesture, and the long patience of the Nile. Out of these early burials comes an idea that will define Egypt for 3,000 years. The ruler is mortal, but kingship is not. The early graves along the Nile lead into a moment that ancient Egyptians themselves remembered as a beginning. Though the real process was almost certainly slower, rougher, and more complicated than later royal tradition liked to admit. Egypt becomes Egypt not in a single sunrise, not because one man simply declares it so, but through generations of rivalry, alliance, ritual invention, and administrative tightening along a river that rewards unity more than chaos. The Nile flows north, carrying boats, grain, messages, cattle, stone, and ambition. Villages grow into towns, regional powers compete, sacred symbols harden into political claims. Somewhere in this long transformation, the ruler of one land begins to imagine himself as a ruler of both. Later Egyptians speak of the two lands, Upper Egypt in the south, stretching along the narrow valley, and Lower Egypt in the north, opening into the wide delta where river branches spread toward the Mediterranean. The names can feel backwards to modern ears, but they follow the river's elevation, not the map's page. Upper Egypt lies upstream, closer to the Nile's southern sources. Lower Egypt lies downstream, where the flood finally fans out into marsh, field, and sea. To rule Egypt is to hold both landscapes together, the confined valley and the open delta, the desert edge south and the watery north, the white crown and the red crown, the long body of the river and its many mouths. The figure most often placed at this threshold is Nama, a king who stands between history, archaeology, and royal memory. His name is linked to the famous ceremonial palette found at Hierakonpolis, where a powerful ruler appears wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. The imagery is formal, symbolic, and unmistakably political. It shows domination, procession, order imposed on disorder, and the king enlarged beyond ordinary human scale. Yet scholars still debate exactly what the palette records. It may commemorate a specific conquest, a ritual claim, a repeated ceremony of kingship, or a symbolic statement of unification already in progress. The evidence remains incomplete, but the message is clear enough by Nama's time. Someone wants the world to see that one ruler can embody both lands. This is one of the great inventions of ancient Egypt, and it is easy to underestimate because it becomes so familiar. The pharaoh is not merely a governor of territory. He is the living knot that ties opposites together, north and south, desert and floodplain, gods and people, order and danger, life and death all meet in the royal body. Later Egyptians will call this balance Mat, the cosmic order that keeps the world from sliding back into confusion. But even before the theology is written in its classic form, the political need is already present. The Nile Valley can be extraordinarily fertile, but only if labour, storage, irrigation, transport, and authority work together. A fractured river world can feed many local powers. A united river world can build a state. The earliest dynasties turn that possibility into habit. Abydos, in Upper Egypt, becomes one of the great royal burial landscapes. There, at el-Kab, early kings are buried in desert ground that will remain sacred for centuries. Their tombs are not pyramids, but they are already royal in ambition. They hold chambers, offerings, imported goods, seal impressions, and signs of a court that continues to operate around the dead. The place becomes so charged with memory that later Egyptians associate it with Osiris, lord of the afterlife, and pilgrims will come seeking closeness to sacred death. Yet in the first dynasty, Abydos is also a political cemetery, where kings of a newly unified Egypt root their authority in ancestral soil. Memphis, meanwhile, rises near the meeting point of valley and delta. Its location is almost too perfect to be accidental. From there, a king can watch the hinge of the country, controlling movement between Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis becomes a capital of administration, a command post placed where geography itself seems to advise central rule. The court can draw resources from the south, the delta, the deserts, and distant trade routes. Officials can seal jars, count goods, organize labor, and dispatch orders. What appears on temple walls as divine kingship depends in practice on scribes, granaries, boats, workshops, and officials who know exactly how much grain has entered a storehouse. The sacred crown needs paperwork, which may be less glamorous than a falcon god, but is probably more useful on a difficult morning. The king's image becomes more consistent. His name appears within a serech, a rectangular frame representing the palace facade, usually topped by the falcon Horus. This is not a small artistic choice. It tells viewers that the king is both a palace ruler and a divine figure watched over, or embodied, by Horus. The palace itself becomes a symbol, not just a building. The king's name becomes a sacred sign. The bureaucracy that sends goods across Egypt and the theology that lifts the ruler toward the gods grow together, each strengthening the other. In early Egypt, administration and myth are not separate worlds. They are two sides of the same royal machine. The unification of Egypt also requires control over memory. Later king lists will smooth the past into ordered sequences, placing rulers one after another as if history naturally preferred straight lines. archaeology shows something more textured. There are regional traditions, uncertain successions, possible conflicts, overlapping symbols, and local elites who do not vanish overnight simply because a central king has appeared. No single explanation fully accounts for how the first dynasties secured their authority. Military force likely played a role, but so did marriage alliances, religious prestige, economic control, ritual display, and the practical advantage of coordinating the Nile's abundance. Egypt was not stitched together with one thread, it was woven. What makes the result extraordinary is its durability. Once the idea of the two lands takes hold, it becomes one of the most stable political myths in world history. Dynasties will rise and fall, capitals will move, foreign rulers will sit on Egypt's throne, priests will compete with kings, and powerful officials will sometimes behave like kings in miniature. Yet the pharaoh will continue to be shown wearing the double crown, smiting chaos, offering to gods, and standing as lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. Even when reality is fractured, the image of unity remains. In Egypt, political theology becomes a way of insisting that the world is whole, even when history says otherwise. This insistence begins in the early dynastic age, when the state is still young enough to experiment but strong enough to leave marks. Royal tombs expand, administrative seals multiply, art settles into conventions that will last for thousands of years. The human body in Egyptian relief adopts its formal grammar head in profile, eye frontal, shoulders broad, legs striding. This style is not a lack of skill, it is a system of clarity, designed to show the most recognizable parts of a person at once. Egypt is learning to make images eternal by making them orderly. The same impulse shapes kingship. The ruler must be legible forever. Along the river, ordinary life continues beneath these grand symbols. Farmers work fields as floodwaters recede. Boatmen move cargo. Craftsmen shape stone vessels with astonishing patience. Women grind grain, weave linen, prepare food, manage households, and participate in local economies that rarely receive the monumental attention given to kings. Priests tend shrines whose gods may still be local before they become national. Officials travel with seals and instructions. The state grows not by replacing daily life, but by reaching into it, measuring it, taxing it, blessing it, and turning its surplus into royal power. What survives in the record suggests that the pharaoh's greatness was built from thousands of smaller acts, repeated until they became civilization. By the end of the early dynastic period, Egypt has created the central idea that will carry the story forward. The king is the living face of unity, and his tomb is the place where that unity seeks permanence. Abydos and Memphis, desert grave and administrative capital, ancestor cult and grain account, falcon god and seal jar all belong to the same unfolding design. The pharaoh has not yet built the pyramids, but the foundation beneath them is already there. Egypt has discovered how to turn landscape into kingdom, ritual into law, and a mortal ruler into the symbol of an immortal order. From that discovery, stone begins to rise. From the early dynastic graves of Abydos and the administrative weight of Memphis, Egyptian kingship begins to do something astonishing. It begins to climb. The royal tomb, once a buried house of mud brick chambers and offerings, rises into the open air and takes on the shape of a monument that can be seen from far away. Death is no longer hidden only beneath the desert surface. It becomes architectural theatre. It becomes stone, height, geometry, and sunlight. The king's body still needs protection in the ground, but his authority now demands a form that dominates the horizon. Egypt is learning that eternity can be built upward. This transformation does not happen in a single leap. The earliest royal and elite tombs use the mastaba form, a flat-roofed rectangular structure with sloping sides, like a low bench set upon the desert. These tombs are already powerful statements. They mark the dead with permanence, create a place for offerings, and separate important people from ordinary burial, yet they remain close to the earth. The great change comes under King Giza of the Third Dynasty. When the royal tomb at Saqqara becomes something the world has never quite seen before, a pyramid made of steps, rising in 6 tiers above a vast funerary complex of courts, shrines, walls, dummy buildings, and ritual spaces. It is not only a tomb, it is a stone version of kingship itself. The name most closely associated with this transformation is Imhotep, Giza's high official, later remembered with such reverence that he becomes almost legendary. He is often credited as the architect behind the step pyramid complex, though the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the full organization of the project. What survives is enough to show a revolutionary idea. Materials once associated with temporary buildings, such as reeds, wood, and mud brick, are translated into limestone. Forms that might once have decayed are made permanent. Doorways that do not open, columns that imitate bundled plants, and buildings that seem symbolic rather than functional, all create a sacred world for the dead king. Saqqara becomes a landscape where stone imitates life in order to defeat time. Giza's step pyramid is sometimes described simply as the first pyramid, but that phrase almost hides its strangeness. It is not yet the smooth-sided form that later becomes the symbol of Egypt. It is a stack of mastabas, enlarged and transformed, as if royal burial has been placed on top of itself again and again until it reaches toward the sky. Beneath it lies a maze of passages and chambers, including spaces decorated with blue faience tiles that imitate reed matting, creating the illusion of a palace in the deep underground. This is one of the lesser-known wonders of the complex. The king's eternal residence is not only above the desert in bright limestone, but also below it, in cool corridors coloured like water, vegetation, and life. The pyramid is therefore not just mass, it is meaning. Later Egyptians connect pyramidal form with the sun, the primeval mound, resurrection, and the king's ascent into the heavens. Some of these interpretations become clearer in later texts, so one must be cautious about reading every later idea back into Giza's age, but the basic direction is unmistakable. The tomb is becoming cosmic. The dead ruler is not merely stored safely. He is placed inside a structure that links earth, sky, creation, and royal power. The pharaoh's death becomes a public claim that order continues. After Giza, Egyptian kings continue experimenting with stone and shape. Some projects fail, shift, or remain unfinished. These imperfect monuments are especially revealing because they show that the pyramid was not born fully solved. It had to be invented through trial, ambition, and occasional architectural inconvenience. Under Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, pyramid building enters its great laboratory phase. At Medum, a step structure is transformed toward a true pyramid form, though its outer layers later collapse or are stripped, leaving a strange tower-like core that seems half ruin, half warning. At Dashur, Sneferu's bent pyramid rises with a dramatic change in angle partway up its sides, perhaps because builders adjusted the design to reduce structural stress. No single explanation fully accounts for the change, but the result is one of Egypt's most memorable monuments, a pyramid that appears to hesitate on its way to heaven. Then comes the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, usually regarded as the first successful true smooth-sided pyramid. Its slope is gentler, its mass broad and stable, its reddish limestone giving it the name by which it is known today. Sneferu's reign may have produced more pyramid volume than any other pharaohs, a reminder that the road to Giza was paved by experimentation on an enormous scale. By the time Khufu comes to power, the technical, administrative, and symbolic foundations are ready for the Great Pyramid, the monument that will eventually become the last standing wonder of the ancient world. Khufu's pyramid at Giza is often surrounded by fantasies because its scale seems almost designed to invite them. But the most remarkable truth is not that unknown beings or lost technologies were required. It is that a centralized Old Kingdom state, with skilled workers, scribes, engineers, quarrymen, boat crews, food suppliers, and administrators, could organize human efforts so effectively more than 4,500 years ago. Fringe theories imagine shortcuts because the real achievement is difficult to absorb, yet the archaeological evidence points not to mystery machines, but to planning, labor organization, quarrying knowledge, ramps or ramp systems still debated in detail, and a society able to turn agricultural surplus into stone. The pyramid is built from millions of blocks, though exact counts vary and are often simplified in popular retellings. Its core stones come largely from local limestone, while finer casing stones are quarried and transported from Tura across the river. Granite for internal chambers travels from Aswan far to the south. Copper tools, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, ropes, water, ramps, and human coordination all play their part. The work is not the labour of enslaved masses as older myths often claimed. Evidence from worker settlements, cemeteries, bakeries, breweries, and administrative records suggests a large organised workforce of skilled and seasonal labourers supported by the state. Their lives were demanding, but they were not invisible. They left bones, tools, graffiti, food waste, and traces of community at the edge of royal eternity. This is one of the central contradictions of the pyramids. They are built for one king, yet they preserve the labour of thousands. The pharaoh stands at the summit of meaning, but beneath him lies an entire society in motion. Farmers rotate into service when the Nile flood covers fields. Bakers produce bread on a massive scale. Brewers make beer that serves as nutrition as much as drink. Officials count rations. Doctors treat injuries. Craftsmen shape stone with astonishing precision. Boatmen move materials through canals and river channels. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a national project that turns Egypt's ecology into architecture. At Giza, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure create a royal landscape of pyramids, temples, causeways, subsidiary tombs, boat pits, and cemeteries. The plateau becomes a stage for divine kingship. Khafra's pyramid, set on slightly higher ground, still seems to challenge Khufu's in visual command, and his valley temple with its hard stone surfaces gives a sense of royal presence stripped of softness. The great Sphinx, usually associated with Khafra's complex, adds another layer of mystery. A lion's body and royal head carved from the living limestone, facing the sunrise, part guardian, part king, part solar symbol. Scholars still debate aspects of its precise meaning and chronology, but within the Giza landscape, it speaks the same language as the pyramid's power fused with cosmic permanence. Inside these monuments, the king's afterlife becomes increasingly elaborate. By the late 5th and 6th dynasties, pyramid texts appear in royal tombs, carved spells meant to help the dead king rise, join the gods, and travel among the stars. These are among the oldest large bodies of religious writing in the world. They reveal a royal afterlife filled with ascent, transformation, danger, protection, and celestial ambition. The king may climb a ladder, fly as a bird, become an imperishable star, or join the sun god. The language is ancient, poetic, sometimes strange, and often difficult to interpret, but its purpose is clear. The pyramid is not enough by itself. Stone needs words, architecture needs ritual, eternity must be spoken as well as built. Yet even at the height of pyramid building, fragility remains. Casing stones are removed in later ages, burial chambers are entered, bodies vanish, names survive unevenly. The monuments outlast their builders, but not untouched. Their endurance can make them seem inevitable, as if Egypt was always destined to produce them. In truth, they are the result of a particular moment when royal ideology, economic capacity, engineering skill, religious imagination, and state control align with extraordinary force. The Old Kingdom pharaohs invent eternity in stone, but they do so in a living world of effort, risk, adjustment, and uncertainty. From the outside, the pyramids seem almost silent. They stand against the desert as pure geometry, stripped of much of their original brightness. But in their own time, they gleam with white casing, catch the sun, connect temples to tombs, and anchor royal cults that require offerings long after the king is gone. They are not dead monuments. They are machines of remembrance. They take the early Egyptian belief that kingship must survive the body and enlarge it until it becomes visible from miles away. The ruler is mortal, but his pyramid insists otherwise, and for a while, Egypt believes the claim strongly enough to move mountains, one block at a time. The pyramids seem to invite isolation. They stand on the edge of the desert with such self-contained force that it is tempting to imagine Old Kingdom Egypt as a closed world, turned inward, obsessed only with its own gods, its own kings, its own river, and its own dream of eternity. The image is powerful, white limestone faces blazing in the sun, royal causeways descending toward valley temples, priests carrying offering for dead kings, scribes counting grain under a sky almost empty of clouds. Yet the more closely the pyramid age is studied, the less isolated it appears. Khufu's world is not a sealed kingdom of stone. It is a society connected by river, desert tracks, seaports, mines, quarries, trade routes, and ideas moving quietly across great distances. This is one of the gentler surprises of ancient Egypt. Its geography seems to protect it, but it never truly cuts it off. To the east, beyond the Nile Valley, the deserts lead toward the Red Sea, Sinai, and the lands of the southern Levant. To the west lie oases and routes across the Sahara, though the climate changes over time and the desert is never a simple empty space. To the south, Nubia offers gold, cattle, hard stone, and cultural worlds that both influence and resist Egypt. To the north, the delta opens toward the Mediterranean, where marshes, channels, and coastal movement connect Egypt to wider regions. The Nile is Egypt's spine, but it is also a highway, and highways tend to carry more than official messages. In the age of the pyramids, the Egyptian state needs materials that cannot all be found conveniently beside the royal building site. Copper comes from desert and Sinai sources, essential for tools even if stone, wood, and human skill do much of the work. Turquoise and other valued stones move through mining expeditions. Cedar and other timber, especially from the Levant, are prized because Egypt itself lacks abundant large trees suitable for certain kinds of construction and boat building. Granite travels from Aswan. Fine limestone is carried from Tura, basalt, alabaster, diorite, and other stones enter royal and elite projects through organized extraction and transport. The pyramid is therefore not only a monument at Giza, it is the final visible point of a network that stretches far beyond the plateau. The harbour installations and papyri associated with Wadi al-Jarf, near the Red Sea, give one of the clearest glimpses into this connected world. There, evidence from Khufu's reign includes administrative documents linked to the transport of limestone blocks and the work of an official named Mera. These records are not grand theological texts. They are practical, almost plain, concerned with movement, supplies, work crews, and the logistics of royal construction. Yet their plainness makes them extraordinary. They show the Pyramid Age not as a misty legend, but as a working state with schedules, teams, boats, loading points, and officials responsible for moving stone through a coordinated system. What survives in the record suggests that Khufu's pyramid was not built by mystery, but by management. Management, however, is its own kind of wonder. To move stone from quarry to river, from river to harbour, from harbour to construction zone, and from ground level upward into a monument of staggering scale requires not only muscle, but timing. The Nile flood matters. Seasonal labour matters. Food storage matters. Boat technology matters. Rope, wood, water, sledges, ramps, tracks, commands, and accounting all matter. A pyramid is often seen as a tomb, but from another angle it is a fossilized bureaucracy. Every block implies a chain of decisions. Every finished surface implies a hidden world of quarry dust, ration lists, sore backs, skilled hands, and someone keeping count. The people behind that system are no longer faceless in the way they once seemed. Worker settlements near Giza, especially the site often associated with the pyramid builder's town, reveal bakeries, breweries, barracks-like galleries, administrative areas, animal bones, and traces of organized provisioning. These were people fed at state expense, supplied with bread, beer, meat, fish, and other foods depending on role and status. Their work was difficult, and injuries were part of life. But the old image of enslaved masses dragging stones under whips does not fit the evidence. The labour force appears to include skilled permanent workers and rotating crews, possibly drawn through forms of state obligation during seasons when agricultural work was less possible. Scholars still debate details of labour organisation, but the broad picture is clear. Pyramid building was a national project, not a simple story of forced misery. Even the names of work gangs preserve something almost unexpectedly human. Some crew names boast of loyalty to the king or strength in royal service. They sound like teams with identity, pride, and perhaps rivalry. Inside hidden spaces of the Great Pyramid, graffiti left by workers includes references to Khufu's name, a practical mark that later becomes historically priceless. These informal traces are not meant for royal display. They are the fingerprints of organization, scratched or painted in places never intended for public eyes. They remind the listener that the pyramid was not assembled by an anonymous mass, but by groups of workers who knew who they served, who belonged to teams, and who left behind small signs of themselves inside the king's eternity. The 2025 genomic study of an Old Kingdom individual from Nuweirat adds another layer to this connected world. Ancient DNA preservation in Egypt is difficult because heat, time, and burial conditions often damage genetic material. So any well-studied genome from this period is valuable. In this case, the remains of a man dated to roughly the age when Egypt's early state and pyramid traditions were taking shape produced evidence of ancestry mostly connected with ancient North African and Egyptian-related populations, but with a measurable component linked to regions of the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. The exact meaning must be handled carefully, because one person cannot stand for all Old Kingdom Egypt, and genetics is not the same as culture or language. Still, the finding fits a larger picture. Egypt was rooted in the Nile Valley, but it was not sealed away from its neighbours. This matters because older stories sometimes imagined ancient civilizations as separate boxes, each developing behind invisible walls until conquest or trade suddenly brought them into contact. The real ancient world was messier and more interesting. Goods moved, people moved, ideas moved. Marriages, migrations, craft techniques, religious motifs, administrative habits, and prestige objects could travel in ways that leave uneven traces. Egypt's identity remained strongly Egyptian, shaped by the Nile, local gods, language, landscape, and royal ideology. But identity does not require isolation. A civilization can be deeply itself and still be connected to the world around it. During the Old Kingdom, Egypt's contacts with the Levant are visible through imported materials and artistic hints, while southern expeditions into Nubia and desert regions bring resources and political encounters. Egyptian kings send mining parties into Sinai. Officials organize journeys to quarry stone and gather valued goods. Boats move along the Nile and perhaps through Red Sea routes more extensively than older models assumed. The state's reach is not empire in the later New Kingdom sense, but it is already outward-looking when resources demand it. Khufu's world is anchored at Giza, yet the pyramid depends on landscapes that Khufu may never personally see. There is a quiet irony here. The pyramid is meant to fix the king forever in one sacred place, but everything that creates it comes from movement. Stone moves, food moves, workers move, officials move, boats move, ideas about kingship, death, stars, and the sun move through ritual traditions and priestly knowledge. The finished monument appears still, but its construction is the result of motion on a national scale. The stillness is an illusion left behind after the work is done. Khufu himself remains a shadow behind his monument. Later traditions sometimes portray him harshly, while his surviving contemporary record is surprisingly limited for a king whose pyramid became the most famous structure in Egypt. This imbalance is another reminder that monumentality does not always preserve personality. The Great Pyramid tells us that Khufu commanded immense resources, that his state could organize labor at extraordinary scale, and that his afterlife ideology demanded a structure of unprecedented precision and mass. It tells us much less about his voice, temperament, fears, or private beliefs. The king becomes enormous in stone and strangely small in biography. The same is true of many Pyramid-age rulers. Khafra and Menkaure are visible through monuments, statues, and royal complexes, but the living human beings behind those forms remain distant. Their queens, officials, craftsmen, priests, and workers sometimes appear more vividly in tomb scenes and settlement remains than the kings do in personal terms. This is not failure. It is the nature of Egyptian royal ideology. The pharaoh is meant to become an image of order, not a diary. The person dissolves into the office, and the office rises in stone. Yet beneath that official image, Old Kingdom Egypt is full of life. In elite tombs near the pyramids, scenes show agriculture, fishing, fowling, cattle, boats, scribes, dancers, musicians, craft production, and offering processions. These scenes are idealized, but they preserve a world the king's afterlife depends upon. The dead elite want eternal access to abundance bread, beer, linen, meat, perfume, servants, fields, and ritual attention. The tomb walls become a kind of permanent Egypt, a painted and carved guarantee that life will continue for the dead as long as the images and words endure. The pyramid is the royal version of this same desire enlarged beyond measure. But enlargement carries cost. Pyramid building demands resources, and over generations the balance between royal ambition, local administration, priestly endowments, and provincial power begins to shift. The very system that makes Khufu's world possible also creates powerful officials and institutions that can outlast individual kings. Royal funerary cults require lands, workers, and offerings. Temples accumulate wealth, provincial leaders gain importance, the state grows more complex. And complexity can be both strength and vulnerability. No single explanation fully accounts for the later weakening of Old Kingdom royal power, but the seeds of change are already hidden inside the Age of Stone certainty. For now, however, the Old Kingdom still holds. The pyramids gleam, the Nile floods, ships carry stone and goods, scribes press seals into clay, work gangs move under orders, priests speak words for dead kings. Foreign materials enter Egyptian hands and become part of Egyptian monuments. A man buried at Nuweirat carries in his bones and ancestry a hint of wider connections that written history only partly preserves. Khufu's world, seen from a distance, looks like a kingdom turned inward toward eternity. Seen closely, it is a crossroads of labor, landscape, exchange, and belief. The Great Pyramid remains the perfect symbol of that paradox. It is a mountain made by a river civilization, a tomb built from national motion, a monument to one king that preserves the lives of many, and a symbol of Egyptian uniqueness created in a world of contact. It seems to stand outside time, but it belongs completely to its time, to Old Kingdom administration, Nile ecology, desert quarries, Levantine timber, copper expeditions, worker communities, royal theology, and the practical genius of a state that knew how to make stone obey an idea. And like all ideas made too heavy, too costly, and too dependent on perfect order, it casts a long shadow. Beyond the bright geometry of Giza lies a harder question. What happens when the flood is poor, when the centre weakens, when local powers rise, when the dead kings require offerings but the living state struggles to provide them? Egypt has invented eternity in stone, but eternity must still be maintained by human hands. In the centuries after the greatest pyramids, those hands begin to loosen. The shadow of the pyramids stretches farther than their builders could have imagined, but shadows are not the same as stability. After the great age of Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, and their successors, Egypt does not suddenly collapse in one clean dramatic moment. There is no single day when divine kingship fails, no final trumpet in the desert, no royal decree announcing that eternity has become too expensive. The weakening comes more slowly, almost like a low flood that never rises high enough. The forms remain. Kings still rule. Tombs are still built. Offerings are still made. Officials still write in the name of order. Yet beneath the official surface, the balance that once allowed Egypt to move mountains begins to change. The Old Kingdom depends on confidence. It depends on the belief that the king stands at the center of the world, that the Nile's rhythm can be managed, that officials will obey the court, that royal projects will unify the country, and that the dead kings of earlier generations can be maintained through temples, estates, priests, and offerings. This is a powerful system, but it is also a demanding one. every royal pyramid complex requires economic support after the king's death. Every funerary cult needs land, labour, and goods. Every temple granted privilege becomes another institution with its own interests. Over generations, the sacred economy of dead kings grows heavy. Egypt has built eternity, but eternity requires maintenance, and maintenance has a way of becoming political. Provincial power also grows. In the early Old Kingdom, the royal court dominates the country with impressive force, but Egypt is long, and distance matters. Local governors, often called nomarchs by modern scholars, administer regions, oversee resources, and become increasingly important in their own territories. Their tombs grow more ambitious, their inscriptions become more self-assured, their families sometimes hold office across generations. What begins as service to the king can slowly become local authority with its own memory and pride. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far this decentralization went before the final crisis. But the pattern is visible enough. The pharaoh remains divine in theory, yet power is no longer concentrated with the same overwhelming clarity. Climate may have made everything harder. Near the end of the Old Kingdom, evidence from across the broader region suggests episodes of aridity and environmental stress. The Nile floods, on which Egyptian agriculture depends, may have become less reliable during parts of this period. A low inundation is not merely bad weather. It means less water in fields, weaker harvests, strained storage, anxious officials, and pressure on the state's ability to redistribute food. No single explanation fully accounts for the end of the Old Kingdom, and it would be too simple to say that drought alone brought down the Pyramid Age. But any civilization built on the river's generosity, repeated poor floods could turn political weakness into crisis. Ancient Egyptians later remembered this kind of disorder with language that feels almost apocalyptic, though their literary texts must be handled carefully. Works that describe a world turned upside down, with the poor and rich changing places and temples neglected, may reflect later reflections on chaos rather than straightforward eyewitness reporting. Still, their emotional truth is revealing. Egyptians understood collapse as the failure of Mat, the order that holds creation together. When the king cannot guarantee abundance, justice, and ritual continuity, the problem is not only administrative, it is cosmic. The world feels wrong. The kings of the late 6th dynasty rule under a long and increasingly burdened system. Pepi II, traditionally credited with an exceptionally long reign, becomes a symbol of Old Kingdom exhaustion, though the exact length and historical details remain debated. A very long reign can create its own difficulties: aging leadership, ambitious officials, delayed succession, and court factions waiting in the wings. Whether Pepi II personally caused decline is not the point. He stands near the edge of a transformation that no single ruler could easily control. By the time central authority weakens, Egypt's old image of one powerful king binding the two lands begins to crack. The first intermediate period that follows is often described as an age of chaos, but that word can mislead. It was certainly a time of political fragmentation, stress, and competing power centres. Yet it was not a blank darkness. Egypt does not vanish. People still farm, worship, trade, write, bury their dead, and organise local life. Culture continues, but it becomes more regional. Instead of one royal court dominating artistic and political expression, local rulers and provincial elites shape their own traditions. This is one of the lesser-known truths of Egyptian history. Periods of so-called decline can also produce creativity, adaptation, and voices that would be harder to hear under stronger central rule. Some provincial tomb inscriptions from this era speak with striking self-presentation. Local leaders describe feeding their communities, maintaining order, helping their towns, and acting as protectors during difficult times. These claims may be idealized, like much Egyptian self-description, but they reveal a changed political world. The good official now presents himself almost as a small-scale king, a provider of stability when the center no longer commands the same trust. The pharaoh's cosmic role has not disappeared, but in practice survival may depend more on the local governor who controls grain stores and labor nearby. Order becomes regional before it becomes national again. Power gathers especially around two rival zones, Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. These centers do not merely represent geography, they represent competing claims to restore Egypt's wholeness. The Heracleopolitan rulers control parts of the north and middle Egypt, while Theban leaders gradually expand from the south. The conflict between them is known mostly through later sources, inscriptions, and archaeological traces, and the details are often difficult to reconstruct. It is enough to say that Egypt's old unity becomes an ambition rather than a fact. The two lands still exist in ideology, but they must be one again. For ordinary communities, the Great Royal Crisis may have felt less like the fall of a pyramid and more like a thinning of certainty. The tax collector might represent a local authority rather than a distant king. Offerings might continue at a town shrine even if royal ceremonies weaken elsewhere. A farmer still watches the flood, because no political theory can replace water. Craftsmen still make pottery, tools, linen, and coffins. Families still care for their dead. The daily rhythms of the Nile persist, but the large frame around them changes. The state that once organized labor toward massive royal monuments no longer seems able to gather all Egypt into one command. Royal burial changes too. The colossal pyramid age has passed. Later kings still build tombs and monuments, but the supreme confidence of Giza is gone. Funerary beliefs begin to broaden in important ways, with ideas once centered on the king becoming increasingly available to non-royal elites. The afterlife, in Egyptian imagination, slowly becomes less exclusively royal. Coffin texts and regional funerary traditions develop in the centuries around and after this period, showing a more widely shared hope for transformation after death. This does not mean Egypt becomes egalitarian in any modern sense. It does mean that the collapse of one form of kingship opens religious space in unexpected ways. That is the strange gift of the first intermediate period. It exposes the pharaoh's vulnerability, but it also reveals the depth of Egyptian civilization beyond the throne. The pyramids had made kings look eternal. Fragmentation proves that kingship can fail, yet Egypt can continue breathing. The river still moves, the gods remain. Local leaders improvise order, scribes preserve memory, tombs grow smaller but more personal. The country is wounded, not erased. And because Egyptians understand disorder so intensely, reunification will never be simply a political achievement. It will feel like healing. When a new dynasty rises from Thebes and brings the two lands together again, the memory of fracture will remain inside Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh will still be divine, but after the old kingdom's cracking, divine power carries a quieter anxiety. Egypt has learned that eternity can be built in stone, but stone does not guarantee obedience, abundance, or peace. A king must not only rise above the world, he must hold it together when the flood is low and the provinces have learned their own strength. The restoration of Egypt does not erase the memory of fracture. It carries that memory inside itself, like a healed break beneath the skin. when Theban power rises from the south and reunites the two lands, the victory is not simply the return of an old formula, it is a new version of kingship, shaped by the knowledge that the centre can fail, provinces can grow proud, and the Nile's generosity cannot be commanded by royal titles alone. Egypt enters what modern scholars call the Middle Kingdom with an older confidence restored, but also with a deeper caution. The pharaoh is still lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. He still stands before the gods. He still claims to maintain Ma'at. Yet the tone has changed. The king is no longer only the dazzling builder of eternity. He is also the guardian of a world that has already come apart once. The reunification is associated above all with Mentuhotep II, the Theban ruler of the 11th dynasty, who brings Egypt back under a single crown after the divisions of the First Intermediate Period. From Thebes, a city that will later become one of the great sacred centres of the ancient world, his power expands northward until the old dream of unity becomes real again. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri, set against the cliffs of western Thebes, already hints at the importance this landscape will hold in later centuries. Long before Hatshepsut builds her famous terraced temple nearby, Mentuhotep's monument places royal memory into the embrace of the western cliffs, where desert, death, and kingship meet with quiet force. This Theban beginning matters because it changes the emotional geography of Egypt. Memphis and the pyramid fields had dominated the Old Kingdom imagination. Now the south speaks with new authority. Theban gods rise in importance, especially Amun, who will eventually become one of Egypt's most powerful deities. The west bank of Thebes becomes a sacred zone of royal afterlife and divine encounter. The Middle Kingdom does not yet create the Valley of the Kings, but it prepares the landscape in which later pharaohs will hide their tombs beneath the cliffs. The first section of this story began with Thutmose II's damaged tomb in that western world. Here, many centuries earlier, the spiritual gravity of Thebes is beginning to gather. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs look backward and forward at the same time. They revive old symbols of royal order, but they do not simply imitate the pyramid age. Their monuments are more restrained in some ways, their political language more reflective. Royal pyramids return, especially under the 12th dynasty, but they are often built with mud brick cores and stone casing, rather than the massive all-stone confidence of Giza. Many have suffered badly over time, leaving forms that are less visually complete than the Old Kingdom pyramids. That difference is easy to misread as weakness. In truth, it reflects a different world of resources, priorities, and royal self-presentation. The Middle Kingdom still values eternity, but it seems more aware of cost, instability, and human limitation. The literature of the age deepens this impression. Some of Egypt's most remarkable texts either emerge from or are preserved in traditions associated with this period. Tales of officials abroad, instructions to kings, meditations on disorder, and stories that explore loyalty, exile, fear, and return. The tale of Sinew, one of the most famous, follows an Egyptian official who flees after a royal death and lives for years outside Egypt before returning to the embrace of the homeland and the king. It is not a simple adventure tale. It is a meditation on belonging, royal grace, and the pull of Egypt as the proper order of the world. Scholars still debate the historical setting and political meanings of such texts, but their emotional world is unmistakable. After fragmentation, Egypt thinks deeply about what it means to leave order and come back to it. Other wisdom texts present kingship with a sharper edge. The ruler is advised to be vigilant, to understand human unreliability, to protect the state from danger, and to trust carefully. These works may not be literal royal diaries, and their dates and authorship can be debated, but they reveal a political imagination marked by anxiety. The king must be strong because disorder is never far away. He must be just because injustice weakens the world. He must be watchful because loyalty is not automatic. This is not the serene confidence of a pyramid gleaming under the sun. It is kingship after a nightmare, kingship that remembers the sound of the center cracking. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty turn this memory into policy. Amenemhat I, who founds the dynasty, appears to shift the royal residence northward to a new capital, often identified as Ichtawi, probably near the entrance to the Fayum. The exact location remains uncertain, which is one of those archaeological frustrations that reminds us how much of even a major royal age can remain hidden. But the political logic is clear. A capital near the middle of the country allows control over both north and south, close enough to Memphis's old administrative heartland while still connected to Theban legitimacy. It is geographical compromise after an age when regional power had become dangerous. The Middle Kingdom state becomes highly active in shaping land and borders. In the Fayum, rulers invest in irrigation and agricultural development, transforming a natural depression linked to the Nile into a more productive zone. This is not merely economic improvement, it is royal ideology made practical. A good king does not only build a tomb, he makes land fertile, manages water, and expands the realm of cultivation. The pharaoh proves order by turning landscape into abundance. As always, the evidence remains incomplete in detail, and the long-term development of the Fayum involves many phases. But the Middle Kingdom's interest in controlled water and productive land fits the wider pattern of restored central power. To the south, the kings push into Nubia and build a chain of fortresses along the Nile, especially in the region of the Second Cataract. These fortresses are among the most impressive and revealing structures of the age. Massive mud brick walls, controlled gateways, storage areas, and administrative spaces show a state deeply concerned with movement, trade, defense, and surveillance. They regulate access to gold, goods, people, and routes between Egypt and the lands farther south. The story should not be told only from Egypt's viewpoint, because Nubia was not an empty frontier but a region of complex societies with their own power and identity. Still, from the Egyptian royal perspective, these fortresses are statements of control. The restored kingdom is determined not to be fragile. Religion also changes in ways that reach beyond the palace. Osiris, once associated especially with royal afterlife and the sacred landscape of Abydos, becomes increasingly central to hopes for the dead more broadly. Abydos grows into one of Egypt's great pilgrimage centers, a place where people want to be buried, commemorated, or symbolically connected with the god who dies and is restored. The appeal of Osiris is profound. He offers not merely survival, but transformation through death into renewed existence. In a civilization that has seen political collapse and recovery, the myth of a god restored from death carries obvious power. Egypt's theology of rebirth becomes more widely shared, more emotionally accessible, and more deeply woven into non-royal funerary life. This does not mean the Middle Kingdom becomes gentle or modern in its values. It remains hierarchical, royal, and deeply unequal. But it is one of the great ages of Egyptian self-reflection. Its kings build, campaign, administer, irrigate, fortify, and write themselves into eternity. Yet its texts preserve unease as well as confidence. The pharaoh is still divine, but he is also responsible in a more humanly legible way. He must feed, protect, judge, build. and remember what happens when these duties fail. What survives in the record suggests a civilization trying not only to restore the past, but to understand it. By the height of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt has regained much of its strength. Its art is refined, sometimes austere, sometimes intensely human. Royal statues, especially of rulers like Senusret III, can show faces that appear stern, tired, watchful, almost burdened. Whether these features are true portraits or deliberate ideological expressions remains debated, but their effect is striking. They do not present kingship as effortless youth. They suggest care, vigilance, and the weight of rule. The face of the pharaoh has learned to look troubled and still remain divine. That is the Middle Kingdom's lasting contribution to the story of Egypt's pharaohs. It proves that collapse is not always the end. Sometimes it becomes memory, and memory becomes a new form of power. The Old Kingdom built mountains of stone to deny mortality. The Middle Kingdom builds a more inward monument, an idea of kingship that knows order must be restored again and again, not merely proclaimed once. Yet beyond its restored confidence, another fracture is already waiting in the long future. Egypt will again divide. Foreign rulers will enter the delta. Thebes will again rise in resistance, and from that second age of uncertainty, the new kingdom will be born with a force Egypt has never seen before. After the restored confidence of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt enters another long narrowing of certainty. The statues may still show kings with calm authority. The temples may still receive offerings, and the Nile may still carry its dark water through the valley. But beneath the old symbols, the country begins once more to loosen. The pharaoh remains the ideal center of the two lands, yet the real map becomes more complicated. Power gathers in different places. Dynasties overlap. Foreign rulers establish themselves in the delta. Local kings claim authority from older sacred cities. Egypt does not simply fall into darkness. It becomes plural, divided, and difficult to read, which is sometimes worse for historians and perhaps no easier for the people who had to live through it. This is the world modern scholars call the Second Intermediate Period, a phrase that sounds tidy only because time has sanded down its confusion. In reality, it is one of the most tangled eras in ancient Egyptian history. The Middle Kingdom's centralized power fades, and different rulers hold different parts of the land. In the north, the Hyksos eventually rule from Avaris in the eastern delta, bringing with them connections to the Levant and a political presence that later Egyptian tradition remembers with hostility. In the south, Thebes remains a center of native Egyptian rule. Between these poles, other powers appear, some still shadowy, some known from only a few names, monuments, seals, or burials. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the sequence, reach, and relationships of these kings. Egypt is still Egypt, but the crown no longer rests easily on one head. Abydos, sacred to Osiris and heavy with the memory of the earliest kings, becomes especially important in this fractured landscape. It is not merely a cemetery. It is a place where royal legitimacy can be drawn from the deep past. To be buried near Abydos is to stand close to Egypt's oldest dynastic roots, and to the god of death and rebirth. The desert there has always been more than desert. It is a theatre of memory, where early kings once placed their tombs, and later generations came seeking symbolic closeness to resurrection. In a divided age, such a place offers more than prestige. It offers a claim even if power is limited, even if rival kings rule elsewhere. A ruler buried at Abydos can wrap himself in the authority of antiquity. This is why the 2025 announcement of a 3,600-year-old royal tomb at Abydos matters so much. The tomb belongs to a king whose identity remains uncertain, associated with what researchers call the Lost Abydos dynasty, a short-lived line of rulers from the Second Intermediate Period. That phrase, lost dynasty, sounds dramatic, but it is not empty drama. These kings are genuinely elusive. Their political reach may have been regional. Their names are not securely fixed in the grand royal memory that later Egyptians preferred to preserve. They ruled in an age when Egypt was divided enough for a king to be real, royal, buried with ceremony, and still nearly vanish from history. The tomb itself does not need to rival the pyramids to be powerful. Its importance lies in what it reveals about a royal court operating under pressure, probably with limited resources compared with the great centralized kingdoms before and after it. It shows that even in a fractured age, kingship still demands architecture, burial ritual, and sacred performance. A ruler may control only part of Egypt, but he still needs to die like a king. He still needs a tomb that tells the world, and the gods, that his reign belongs to the royal order. What survives in the record suggests a reduced but persistent vision of pharaonic dignity smaller in scale than Giza, less secure than the Middle Kingdom, yet still determined to speak the language of eternity. There is something deeply human in this. The more unstable power becomes, the more fiercely rulers often cling to symbols of permanence. A king of the Abydos dynasty may not command all the Nile, may not control the delta, may not possess the resources of a Khufu or a Senusret, but his tomb still reaches for the same sacred grammar. It says that kingship continues. It says that the dead ruler deserves ritual passage. It says that political limitation does not cancel cosmic ambition. In the old Egyptian imagination, the office of king is larger than the temporary weakness of any one dynasty. Even a regional pharaoh can be wrapped in the symbols of universal rule. Yet the tomb also exposes the gap between ideology and reality. The pharaoh is supposed to hold the two lands, but this ruler likely does not. The royal tomb claims eternity, but the king's name is uncertain. The burial asserts identity. But modern archaeologists must piece that identity together from architecture, pottery, inscriptions, and context. No single explanation fully accounts for how this Abydos line fit into the wider politics of the age. Were these rulers rivals to Thebes? Survivors of an older administration, local kings filling a vacuum, or part of a more complex political arrangement that the surviving record has badly thinned? The answer remains debated. What matters for the story is that Egypt's kingship could fragment without disappearing. Abydos makes that fragmentation visible. The sacred landscape holds the earliest dynastic past, the Osirian hope of rebirth, and now this strange evidence of kings who seem to flicker between history and absence. One can imagine the funeral of such a ruler without inventing too much. Priests move through ritual actions inherited from a long tradition. Officials supervise objects, seals, and offerings. Craftsmen complete chambers that may be modest compared with older royal monuments, but still carry serious meaning. The king's body is prepared for the afterlife according to Egyptian expectations of transformation and protection. The ceremony insists on order even as the political world outside remains divided. This insistence is one of the most remarkable features of Egyptian civilization. Even when central power breaks, the language of kingship survives. Crowns, titles, gods, funerary architecture, and ritual patterns continue to circulate. Local rulers do not abandon the pharaonic idea, they compete to possess it. That is very different from a simple collapse. It means the symbol of Pharaoh has become so powerful that even fragmentation cannot kill it. The office is wounded, but everyone still understands its value. The Second Intermediate Period also reminds us that Egypt was never sealed from its neighbours. The Hyksos presence in the Delta reflects deep connections between Egypt and Western Asia, including movement of people, goods, weapons, artistic styles, and technologies. Later Egyptian memory often turns these northern rulers into symbols of disorder, but archaeology suggests a more complex world of cultural contact as well as conflict. Since the next great transformation will come from the struggle between Thebes and the north, it is important to pause here and recognize that foreign presence in Egypt was not a sudden contamination of a pure world. Egypt had always been connected. What changes is the political balance of those connections. For the pharaohs, the lesson is brutal. Divine kingship can survive as an idea even when royal power fractures in practice. A king can be buried at Abydos and still be forgotten. A dynasty can claim legitimacy and still leave only traces. The sacred past can lend authority, but it cannot guarantee victory. The tomb of the unknown Abydos king sits at the heart of this contradiction. It is both a royal monument and an admission of historical fragility. It proves that someone ruled, commanded, died, and was honoured. It also proves how close even kings can come to vanishing completely. Out of this divided world, Thebes will rise again, not merely as a regional power, but as the engine of a new Egyptian age. The memory of fragmentation will sharpen its ambition. The presence of northern rivals will give its kings an enemy against whom unity can be reborn. The old symbols will be taken up once more, but with a more militarized force, a wider horizon, and a hunger for security beyond Egypt's borders. The unknown king at Abydos remains behind in the sand, part of a lost dynasty still emerging from fragments, while the story of Pharaoh moves towards storm, reunification, and empire. The unknown king at Abydos belongs to a time when Egypt's old certainty has thinned, and the thinning is felt most sharply in the north. The delta, with its many river branches, marshes, fields, and routes toward the Levant, has always been more open than the narrow southern valley. Goods arrive there easily, people arrive there easily, ideas arrive there easily. For much of Egyptian history, this openness is a strength, a way for the Nile kingdom to draw in timber, metals, animals, craft traditions, and foreign luxuries. But in the Second Intermediate Period, openness also becomes political vulnerability. The Eastern Delta becomes the seat of rulers remembered by later Egyptians as the Hyksos, foreign kings who establish themselves at Avaris and hold power over a large part of northern Egypt. The word Hyksos comes through Egyptian language as a term often translated as rulers of foreign lands, and later tradition turns them into a symbol of disruption. Yet the archaeological reality is more complex than a simple invasion story. People from Western Asia had lived in the Delta for generations before Hyksos rule. Their presence reflects trade, migration, service, intermarriage, and the slow movement of communities across connected landscapes. Avaris itself becomes a richly mixed place, with Egyptian and Levantine elements visible in burial customs, material culture, architecture, and daily life. Scholars still debate the exact process by which Hyksos power emerged, but the evidence does not require a sudden, overwhelming conquest from outside. It may have been a more gradual rise of an already established elite in a weakened political environment. This does not make the Hyksos harmless in Egyptian memory. From the viewpoint of later Theban kings, they are rivals occupying the north, ruling from a delta capital and interrupting the ideal unity of the two lands. Egyptian royal ideology cannot easily tolerate a divided country. It can explain brief disorder, it can denounce enemies, it can celebrate restoration, but it cannot comfortably admit that multiple centers of power might all be legitimate. So the Hyksos become, in later stories, the great northern problem to be expelled. The reality was probably more entangled, but the political emotion was real. For Thebes, unity must be recovered, and recovery requires an enemy. The Hyksos period also changes Egypt because it intensifies contact with the military and technological world of the Near East. Horses and chariots, composite bows, new forms of weapons, and different styles of fortification and warfare become associated with this age, though no single explanation fully accounts for exactly how each innovation entered Egyptian use. Some may have arrived through Hyksos networks, some through broader regional exchange, and some through Egyptian adaptation over time. What matters is that by the end of the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt is no longer the same inward-looking river kingdom that built the pyramids. It has been forced to learn from the wider world at close range, and some of those lessons will later help create an empire. In the south, Thebes grows harder, more ambitious, and more defined by resistance. The Theban rulers of the 17th dynasty occupy a tense position. They are Egyptian kings, but not rulers of all Egypt. They look north toward Hyksos power and south toward Nubia, caught between strategic pressures. Their monuments and records preserve only part of the story, and the details of their campaigns remain difficult to reconstruct. Yet the broad movement is clear. Thebes begins as a regional kingdom and becomes the force that will reunify the country. The old Middle Kingdom memory of restoration now returns in a sharper, more militarized form. Sekenenretau, Kamose, and Ahmose stand near the heart of this transformation. Sekenenretau is remembered as one of the Theban rulers involved in the struggle against the Hyksos, though his exact actions are partly obscured by later tradition and fragmentary evidence. Kamose, his successor or close relative, leaves inscriptions that present him as a king unwilling to tolerate Egypt's division. These texts are royal propaganda, carefully shaped to magnify courage and legitimacy. But they reveal the ideological force of the conflict. Egypt must not remain split between a northern foreign ruler and a southern Theban king. The two lands demand one crown. Ahmose completes the work. He drives the Hyksos from Avaris, pursues campaigns into southern Canaan, secures Egypt's borders, and becomes the founder of the 18th dynasty, the first dynasty of the New Kingdom. Later generations will look back on this as a great liberation, the moment Egypt throws off foreign rule and restores divine order. The historical process was likely more complex than that clean memory allows, but Ahmose's achievement is undeniable. He reunifies Egypt and gives the kingship a new direction. The pharaoh is no longer only the guardian of the Nile Valley. He is now a ruler whose security depends on projecting force beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Around this same broad era, another event haunts the eastern Mediterranean, the eruption of Thera, the volcano on the island now called Santorini. In popular imagination, this eruption is often pulled into dramatic stories about Egypt, the Exodus, Atlantis, or sudden catastrophe. But careful chronology is less obedient to drama. Recent radiocarbon work connected with the end of the 17th dynasty and the beginning of the 18th suggests that the eruption occurred before the reign of Ahmose, rather than neatly within it. This matters because it warns against arranging ancient disasters too conveniently around famous rulers. The evidence remains debated in some details, but the safer point is clear. Thera belongs to the troubled world before Egypt's new kingdom consolidation, not as a simple cause of a Moses' rise, but as part of a wider Eastern Mediterranean age of instability, contact, and environmental shock. For Egypt, the most immediate storm is political. The old pharaonic ideal has survived two great periods of fragmentation, but it has changed each time. After the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom pharaoh becomes a restorer, administrator, and watchful shepherd of order. After the second intermediate period, the New Kingdom pharaoh becomes something more outward-facing and more martial. Egypt has learned that danger can come from beyond the delta, that foreign powers can settle inside its borders, and that unity may require not only ritual authority but military reach. The result is a kingship with a longer arm. This new kingship is still deeply religious. Thutmose does not present reunification as ordinary politics. He restores temples, honors gods, rewards loyal officials, and places his victory within the language of Ma'at. The Hyksos are cast as disorder, Thebes as restoration, and the king as the one who brings Egypt back into alignment with the divine pattern. Yet beneath the theology lies a practical transformation. Fortresses, campaigns, chariotry, professional soldiers, diplomatic awareness, and control of border zones become more important than ever. Egypt's future pharaohs will inherit a state that is both ancient and newly sharpened. The human cost of this transformation is mostly hidden behind royal victory language. The inscriptions celebrate kings, gods, and triumphs, while ordinary lives appear only in glimpses, soldiers rewarded with gold, officials boasting of service, communities shifting under new authority, craftspeople adapting to new demands. It is important not to turn the story into spectacle. War in ancient texts is often made formal and symbolic, but in reality it rearranges families, labour, land, and memory. The record does not preserve those experiences evenly. What survives most clearly is the voice of the winning court, announcing that order has returned. By the time Thutmose's reign establishes the 18th dynasty, Egypt stands at the edge of its most famous imperial age. The pyramids are already ancient. Abydos has buried forgotten kings. Thebes has risen from regional power to national saviour. The delta has been lost and recovered. Foreign contact has become both threat and tool. The pharaoh, once imagined chiefly as the eternal centre of the Nile, now looks beyond the river with new urgency. Out of the storms before the new kingdom comes a ruler who must guard Egypt not by hiding from the world, but by entering it. Out of the struggle with the Hyksos, Egypt emerges with an old crown and a new horizon. The two lands are united again, but reunification is no longer enough. The kings who follow Thutmose inherit a country that remembers occupation, rivalry, and vulnerability at the delta's edge. The lesson is hard and simple. Egypt cannot feel safe if power beyond its borders remains unchecked. So the pharaoh begins to look outward with a force earlier kings rarely matched. The Nile Valley remains the sacred centre. The Black Land still feeds the temples, and the gods still receive offerings in the old forms, but the royal imagination expands. A king is no longer only the divine maintainer of Egypt. He becomes a campaigner, a builder of borderlands, a receiver of foreign tribute, and eventually the master of an empire. Thutmose stands at the threshold of this transformation. His victory over the Hyksos restores unity, but his campaigns beyond Egypt's northeastern frontier signal something more than recovery. The eastern Mediterranean and southern Levant are no longer distant zones of trade and occasional concern. They become strategic landscapes. To the south, Nubia is again drawn into Egypt's military and economic orbit, especially because of its gold. roots, and long-standing importance to royal power. The pharaoh's authority begins to stretch along roads, rivers, fortresses, and garrisons. What survives in the record suggests that New Kingdom Egypt is born not simply from triumph, but from anxiety turned into policy. This new kingdom needs a new kind of royal image. The pharaoh is still son of Ra, beloved of Amun, lord of ritual, and guarantor of Mut, yet he is increasingly shown as a warrior whose strength protects the cosmic order. Temple walls present enemies subdued beneath royal power, foreign lands offering tribute, and gods granting victory. Such scenes are not neutral reports. They're carefully shaped images of kingship, repeating the idea that Egypt's ruler defeats chaos wherever it appears. Scholars still debate how closely individual reliefs reflect specific historical events, but their ideological message is unmistakable. The king's violence in art is not portrayed as personal rage. It is presented as cosmic housekeeping, which is a very Egyptian way of making imperial ambition sound like religious duty. Thebes becomes the heart of this world. Its local god Amun rises from regional importance to national supremacy, especially through association with royal victory. Amun is hidden and powerful, unseen yet present, a god whose favour can explain the sudden greatness of Theban kings. The great temple complex at Karnak grows into one of the most important religious landscapes in Egypt. Each ruler adds, expands, restores, or inscribes, turning the temple into a stone archive of devotion and authority. Amun's priesthood becomes wealthy and influential, because gods who help kings win wars tend to receive excellent property afterward. This partnership between crown and temple is one of the engines of the new kingdom, but it also plants seeds of future tension. Divine favour is useful. A rich priesthood is useful too, until it becomes powerful enough to be inconvenient. The early 18th dynasty is filled with rulers whose lives connect in complicated ways, and the royal family itself becomes a field of political meaning. Amos's successors consolidate what he wins. Amenhotep I strengthens the new order and is later honoured deeply in the Theban necropolis, where he becomes associated with the community of royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina. Thutmose I pushes Egypt's military reach farther, campaigning into Nubia and the Levant and helping establish the pattern of expansive royal power. His reign also matters for the history of royal burial. Around this age, kings increasingly turn away from pyramid forms and toward hidden tombs cut into the western cliffs. The royal afterlife is still magnificent, but secrecy begins to replace visibility. The pyramid had declared eternity to the horizon. The New Kingdom tomb tries to protect eternity by concealment. That change is one of the most revealing shifts in Egyptian royal history. The Old Kingdom pharaoh built a mountain in the open desert, wrapped in sunlight. The New Kingdom pharaoh enters the mountain itself. The reason is partly practical. Pyramids had been robbed, and visible tombs invited attention across centuries. But the shift is also theological and geographical. The western valleys of Thebes, with their dry wadis and pyramid-shaped peak of El-Qurn rising above the necropolis, offered a natural sacred landscape. The king could be hidden in the body of the West, surrounded by texts of the underworld, moving through darkness toward rebirth like the sun. The royal tomb becomes less a public monument and more a secret cosmos. Thutmose II, whose rediscovered tomb brought this story into motion, belongs to this world of transition and ambition. His reign is not as well known as those of his father Thutmose I, his wife and half-sister Hatshepsut, or his son Thutmose III. He appears almost like a bridge between stronger personalities, which is one reason his newly identified tomb feels so important. Archaeology has a way of returning attention to figures history has pushed into the margins. Thutmose II's reign may have included military activity in Nubia and the Levant, but the evidence is limited, and scholars still debate how much power he exercised personally and how much later memory was shaped by those who followed him. Yet his place in the royal line is crucial. Through him, the dynastic tension of the early 18th dynasty passes into one of Egypt's most extraordinary political arrangements. That arrangement centers on Hatshepsut. At first, she stands within the expected royal framework as a great royal wife, and then as a leading royal woman during a delicate succession. Over time, she assumes the full titulary and visual language of kingship. Her reign will deserve its own careful attention, because it cannot be reduced to novelty or ambition alone. For now, it is enough to see that the new kingdom allows unusual political solutions when divine legitimacy, bloodline, temple support, and court power align. Hatshepsut's rule does not interrupt the rise of empire. In many ways, it helps stabilize the state before Thutmose III's long military career. Egypt's kingship proves flexible, even while claiming eternal tradition. Thutmose III eventually becomes the great campaigner of the dynasty, a ruler whose military actions extend Egyptian influence deep into the Levant and secure dominance in Nubia. Later generations remember him as one of Egypt's most formidable warrior kings. His campaigns, including the famous battle at Megiddo, are recorded in detail at Karnak, where royal victory becomes sacred inscription. These records are still royal texts, shaped by ideology and the desire to magnify the king. But they preserve a striking picture of a pharaoh who organizes repeated campaigns, manages foreign rulers, collects tribute, and turns Egypt into the central power of a wide imperial system. The pharaoh now rules not only through monuments beside the Nile, but through networks of vassals, garrisons, hostages, gifts, letters, and fear. Empire changes Egypt's imagination of wealth. Gold from Nubia, luxury goods from abroad, exotic animals, fine woods, metals, and foreign tribute flow toward temples and palaces. The king offers these goods to Amun, and in return the god's favour justifies further royal success. The cycle is elegant and dangerous. Conquest enriches temple and crown. Temple and crown present conquest as divine order. Foreign lands become part of Egypt's ceremonial universe. Shown on walls as places that naturally bow before Pharaoh. Reality, of course, is less obedient. Imperial control requires constant attention, negotiation, intimidation, and renewal. No single explanation fully accounts for how Egypt maintained its influence across such varied regions. But the pattern is clear. New Kingdom kingship is outward-facing because it must be. The human world behind this imperial system is vast. Soldiers march far from the Nile. Scribes record supplies and tribute. Messengers move through dangerous roads. Foreign princes may be brought into Egyptian settings and educated in ways meant to bind them to the crown. Craftsmen produce objects from imported materials. Priests bless victories they did not fight for. Farmers in Egypt continue to grow the grain that supports temples, armies, and royal projects. The empire rests on ordinary labour as much as heroic inscription. The pharaoh's image expands, but it is still carried by human backs, counted by human hands, and preserved by human memory. By the time Thutmose III's achievements settle into stone, the office of pharaoh has changed again. It began as the sacred knot tying the two lands together. It became the builder of pyramids, then the restorer after collapse, then the survivor of fragmentation. Now it is imperial, confident, mobile, and armed with the memory of past vulnerability. The king still belongs to Egypt's gods, but his shadow falls across lands beyond the Nile. The empire that rises from Thebes is brilliant, wealthy, and formidable. It is also dependent on personalities, campaigns, succession, and the uneasy partnership between crown and temple. At its centre stands the pharaoh, more powerful than ever, and therefore surrounded by more ways for power to become unstable. The empire rising from Thebes does not move forward in a straight line, because royal families rarely do. Behind the smooth images on temple walls, succession can be delicate, bloodlines can become tangled, and power can gather around a person whom later tradition does not quite know how to handle. After Thutmose II, Egypt stands at one of those dangerous thresholds where the official language remains calm, but the political situation must have required extraordinary care. A king is dead. A royal child, Thutmose III, stands in the line of succession, and beside him is Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, great royal wife of Thutmose II, a woman of impeccable royal blood and unusual authority, positioned at the heart of the court when Egypt needs continuity more than drama. In the formal world of Egyptian kingship, this could have been presented simply: Hatshepsut could act as regent, protecting the young king's position until he ruled fully in his own right. Such arrangements were not impossible in ancient monarchies, where dynastic survival mattered more than neat categories. But Hatshepsut's story does not remain within that narrow frame. Over time, she assumes the full titles, images, and rituals of kingship. She's not merely a queen acting behind the throne. She becomes king. Her monuments present her with royal crowns, false beard, offering poses, divine birth scenes, and the complete machinery of pharaonic legitimacy. The language of Egypt bends around her, not by abandoning tradition, but by using tradition to make her rule appear inevitable. This is one of the most fascinating features of Hatshepsut's reign. She does not present herself as a rebel against kingship. She presents herself as its rightful fulfillment. Her inscriptions emphasize divine approval, royal descent, and the favor of Amun. Her famous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri rises in terraces against the western cliffs, near the earlier monument of Mentuhotep II, linking her to Theban restoration and sacred geography. The building is elegant rather than massive, disciplined rather than overwhelming. Its colonnades seem almost to grow from the cliffs behind them, creating a union between architecture and landscape that is different from the pyramids, but no less ambitious. Here, Hatshepsut does not need a mountain built block by block. She places herself before the mountain and makes the cliff part of her eternity. Deir el-Bahri also reveals the wider world of her reign. Reliefs show the expedition to Punt, a distant land associated with incense, exotic trees, luxury goods, animals, and divine fragrance. The exact location of Punt remains debated, with scholars placing it somewhere in the Red Sea region, perhaps around the Horn of Africa or nearby areas connected through maritime exchange. What matters in the Egyptian imagination is that Hatshepsut brings the marvels of a far land back to Amun. Meurtries are transported, goods are counted, foreign abundance is made to flow toward Thebes. The scene is not conquest in the style of Thutmose III's campaigns. It is a different royal achievement, peaceful expedition, sacred exchange, and wealth gathered through controlled contact with the mysterious edges of the known world. Yet Hatshepsut's authority also rests on something more intimate and more fragile memory. She's tied to the dead Thutmose II, and the 2025 identification of his tomb in Wadi C brings that connection into sharper focus. The tomb's royal decoration, including underworld scenes and a starry ceiling, places it within the sacred language of New Kingdom kingship. Evidence suggesting that Hatshepsut oversaw aspects of Thutmose II's funerary arrangements fits the political reality of the moment. A royal widow with strong bloodline authority, acting during a sensitive succession, would have had every reason to ensure that the dead king's burial was performed correctly, visibly, and with full legitimacy. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the precise sequence of events, but the possibility is powerful. Hatshepsut's rise may begin not only in courts and temples, but in the rituals surrounding a dead king, whose tomb was later damaged and emptied by ancient crisis. The flood damage in Thutmose II's tomb gives that moment an almost unsettling human texture. Royal burials are meant to look eternal, but this one appears to have been disrupted by nature itself. If the body and burial goods were moved to protect them, the decision would have combined practical emergency with sacred responsibility. Hatshepsut, if involved, would have stood at the intersection of grief, ritual, politics, and dynastic survival. She needed the deceased king properly transformed into an eternal being. She needed the young Thutmose III's legitimacy preserved. She needed the court to see continuity. And, as her own power expanded, she needed the past arranged in a way that made her kingship not a break, but a continuation. That is the quiet genius of her political presentation. Hatshepsut does not erase Thutmose II. She uses the dynastic line that connects them. She does not deny Thutmose III. For much of her reign, he remains present, sometimes shown in subordinate but legitimate relation to her. Egypt's official images create a shared royal world that may have been more complicated in practice than the walls admit. No single explanation fully accounts for how court factions, priesthoods, military leaders, and royal relatives balanced their interests during her reign. But her success suggests that she commanded serious support, especially from powerful officials in the priesthood of Amun. A person does not build Deir el-Bahari by accident. Her reign seems prosperous and stable. She restores temples, commissions obelisks, expands sacred spaces, and emphasizes building rather than constant war. At Karnak, her obelisks declare an almost solar confidence, rising like stone rays before a moon. Their height and brilliance transform devotion into spectacle. Obelisks are not only monuments, they are petrified sunlight, connecting the king to solar power and temple ritual. For Hatshepsut, they are also statements of presence. A female-born ruler in a male-coded office makes herself impossible to ignore by placing her name and image into the most sacred architecture of Thebes. And yet, after her death, parts of that presence are attacked. Images are chiseled away, names are removed or replaced, statues are broken or buried. For a long time, this destruction was imagined as the personal revenge of Thutmose III, finally freed from the shadow of a dominating stepmother. Modern scholarship is more cautious. The erasures appear selective, and many may have occurred later in Thutmose III's reign, perhaps for reasons of dynastic legitimacy rather than simple anger. The goal may have been to smooth the royal line, reducing the awkward memory of a woman who had ruled as king between Thutmose II and Thutmose III. Scholars still debate the motives and timing, but the pattern reveals how threatening memory can be. Hatshepsut's reign had been legitimate enough to function. Later, it became inconvenient enough to edit. This editing did not work completely. Stone is stubborn, and archaeology has a long patience. Broken statues can be reassembled, Erased names can leave traces, buried fragments can return to light. Hatshepsut's attempt to make herself eternal was wounded, but not destroyed. In a strange way, the campaign against her memory made her even more compelling to the modern world. She becomes the pharaoh who ruled successfully, was partly erased, and then returned through excavation. Her story exposes the Egyptian obsession with permanence from the other side to live forever. One needed a name. To remove someone from history, one attacked the name. Memory was not metaphor, it was survival. Hatshepsut's reign sits between the damaged tomb of Thutmose II and the military brilliance of Thutmose III, and that position gives it unusual depth. She belongs to funerary crisis, sacred architecture, dynastic strategy, foreign expedition, temple wealth, and later erasure. She shows that Pharaoh was not only a man's body beneath a crown, but an office powerful enough to absorb and transform identity when the political and religious conditions allowed it. Egypt's tradition looked eternal, but it was more flexible than it admitted. It could make Hatshepsut king, then try to pretend the solution had never happened. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari still hold her monument in their pale embrace, while somewhere in the western valleys the tomb of Thutmose II reminds us how fragile royal plans could be. One ruler is nearly lost through flood, movement, and absence. Another is nearly lost through deliberate erasure. Both survive because fragments refuse to disappear, and from their intertwined memory, the story moves toward a different kind of royal power, the golden calm of Amenhotep III, when empire, wealth, diplomacy, and divine kingship seem to shine so brightly that Egypt almost forgets how easily order can crack. The brilliance that follows Hatshepsut and Thutmose III does not feel at first like a warning. It feels like sunlight held in stone. By the time Amenhotep III comes to the throne, Egypt has already been transformed by the achievements of the early 18th dynasty. Its borders are secure, its temples are wealthy. Its army has carried royal authority far beyond the Nile, and foreign courts understand that the pharaoh is not merely a river king watching his own fields. He's one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age world. Gold moves north from Nubia. Tribute and diplomatic gifts travel along roads and sea routes. Palace workshops produce objects of astonishing refinement. The god Amun receives wealth on a scale earlier generations might have found almost dangerous. Egypt enters an age of golden calm, but calm is not the same as stillness. Beneath the luxury, the royal machine is working harder than ever to turn abundance into divine permanence. Amenhotep III is often remembered as one of Egypt's most magnificent kings, though not primarily because he spent his reign in constant conquest. His power rests on what earlier rulers built. The empire is already established. The campaigns of Thutmose III and his successors have created a world in which Egypt's prestige reaches into Nubia, the Levant, and the diplomatic imagination of other great courts. Amenhotep III inherits this system and adorns it. He rules less like a desperate warrior struggling to prove legitimacy, and more like a cosmic monarch whose greatness can be expressed through building, ceremony, diplomacy, and spectacle. What survives in the record suggests a reign of immense wealth and confidence. But scholars still debate the precise balance between real political stability and royal propaganda. Egyptian kings were experts at making strength look effortless. His court is a world of polished surfaces. Palaces rise with painted floors, gardens, pools, carved columns, and rooms alive with colour. The royal residence at Malkata, on the west bank of Thebes, gives a glimpse of a king who does not live only among temples and tombs, but amid a carefully constructed environment of pleasure, administration, and ceremony. Mud brick walls once glowed with painted decoration. Floors showed water, birds, plants, and bound enemies beneath the king's feet, turning even movement through a palace into a statement of cosmic control. This is one of the lesser-known details that changes how the reign feels. Amenhotep's world was not only monumental from the outside, it was immersive from within, surrounding the royal household with images of abundance and domination so constant that ideology became atmosphere. At Karnak and Luxor, Amenhotep III enlarges the sacred presence of Thebes. His building projects are not random acts of vanity, they are theological architecture. Temples are places where gods are fed, clothed, praised, awakened, carried in procession, and renewed through ritual. The king, as the one human being ideally suited to serve every god, appears again and again on walls offering mat, incense, wine, flowers, food, and precious objects. In practice, priests perform the daily rituals. But in art, the king remains the essential mediator. The temple is therefore a working machine of divine relationship, and every new court, column, statue, and inscription strengthens the claim that Amenhotep III is beloved by the gods and necessary to the world's continuation. His statues make that claim at overwhelming scale. The colossi of Memnon, two-seated giants on the west bank of Thebes, are all that remain standing prominently from his vast mortuary temple, which was once among the largest religious complexes in Egypt. They show the king enthroned, massive and calm, facing east toward the rising sun and the living land across the river. Today they stand weathered and solitary, but in their original setting they belong to a sprawling landscape of courts, statues, ritual spaces, and sacred architecture. Their survival is almost misleading, because the ruins around them are only a fraction of what once existed. The evidence remains incomplete, and much of the temple was damaged by floods, stone reuse, earthquakes, and time. Yet the surviving scale is enough to reveal Amenhotep's ambition. He didn't merely build for death. He built to make his divine presence unignorable. Royal divinity becomes especially intense in his reign. Earlier pharaohs were divine in office, but Amenhotep III seems to push the living king's solar and godlike identity with unusual emphasis. His jubilees, or said festivals, celebrate renewal of royal power, presenting him as eternally vigorous and cosmically restored. These ceremonies are not simple anniversaries. They are rituals of rejuvenation, meant to renew the king's strength and reaffirm his ability to sustain order. In Amenhotep's case, they become elaborate expressions of almost radiant kingship, filled with divine association, spectacle, and controlled performance. No single explanation fully accounts for how these rituals were experienced by different audiences, from priests to officials to common people who may have seen only parts of royal ceremony. But their political message was clear. The king is not fading with age. He's being renewed like the sun. Diplomacy adds another shine to the reign. The world of Amenhotep III is linked to other great powers: Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, Hatti, Al-Ashir, and city-states of the Levant. The Amarna letters, preserved from the later archive associated with Akhenaten's reign, include correspondence that illuminates this international system, including relationships formed and maintained during Amenhotep III's time. Great kings address one another as brothers, exchange gifts, negotiate marriages, request gold, complain about insufficient generosity, and manage the delicate theatre of equality and rivalry. Egypt's gold is famous, and foreign rulers want it badly. Amenhotep III's court can use wealth as diplomacy, turning Nubian resources and Egyptian craftsmanship into influence without sending armies every season. It is a softer form of empire, though never entirely soft for those living under Egyptian pressure in vassal territories. Queen T stands beside this golden kingship with unusual prominence. She's not a decorative shadow. She appears in inscriptions, statues, scarabs, diplomacy, and royal ideology, with a visibility that suggests real importance at court. Her non-royal origins, as far as the evidence suggests, did not prevent her from becoming one of the most powerful women of the new kingdom. Commemorative scarabs announce royal events and circulate messages of the king's achievements, including marriage, hunts, building, and foreign connections. These objects are small compared with temples, but they are powerful tools of royal communication. A scarab can travel. It can place the king's story in many hands. It can make propaganda intimate. And yet, in this gold-lit world, something begins to shift. Amun's wealth is immense. Solar theology grows stronger. The king's own divinity is emphasized with unusual force. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun, appears with increasing importance before the radical changes of the next reign. It would be too simple to say that Amenhotep III causes the Amarna revolution directly, as if history moves like a straight corridor from one idea to another. Scholars still debate how much continuity connects his religious developments with Akhenaten's later reforms, but what survives in the record suggests that the Amarna shock does not emerge from nowhere. It grows from a court already fascinated by sunlight, royal divinity, and the power of visible radiance. Amenhotep III's tomb, reopened in 2025 after more than 2 decades of restoration, gives this golden calm a quieter ending. In the Western Valley, the king who filled Egypt with colossal images and radiant claims descends at last into the hidden world of royal burial. Restoration work allows modern visitors and scholars to encounter again the fragile remains of a tomb, shaped by the same hope that guided Thutmose II's damaged chamber. The king must travel through death toward renewal. The colours, spaces, and surviving decoration are not merely art. They are remnants of a sacred technology meant to carry a divine ruler beyond the limits of the body. That the tomb required modern restoration is itself a reminder of the old contradiction. Pharaohs built for eternity, but eternity needs repair. Amenhotep's reign can feel like Egypt at its most secure, rich, diplomatic, monumental, sunlit, confident. But the very intensity of that confidence casts a strange glow over what follows. His son will inherit not only wealth and empire, but a religious system heavy with power, a priesthood of Amun grown vast, a court fluent in divine imagery, and a royal ideology already leaning toward the sun. The golden calm does not collapse immediately. It brightens, concentrates, and then changes colour. Out of Amenhotep III's radiance comes Akhenaten's shockwave, and Egypt's most dazzling stability turns toward one of its most unsettling experiments. The brilliance of Amenhotep III does not fade gently into ordinary succession. It bends, intensifies, and becomes something stranger. When his son comes to power, first under the name Amenhotep IV, Egypt inherits a young king standing inside one of the wealthiest religious systems the ancient world has ever built. Amun's temples are rich, Thebes is sacred, the empire is still impressive, and the royal house is surrounded by images of solar power that have been gathering force for generations. At first, the new reign seems to belong to that same world. The king bears a traditional name honouring Amun. He offers to the gods. He appears within the familiar ceremonial language of Pharaoh, yet very quickly, the centre of gravity begins to move. The new focus is the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, whose rays reach down toward the king and royal family with small hands of life. The Aten is not entirely new. Solar religion has deep roots in Egypt, and the sun has always been central to royal theology. Ra, Atum, Herakti, and other solar forms have shaped kingship for centuries. What changes under Amenhotep IV is not that the sun becomes important, but that one solar form is elevated with such force that the older balance of the gods begins to break. The king changes his name to Akhenaten, often understood as one who is effective for the Aten. A royal name, in Egypt, is not cosmetic. It is identity, theology, and political statement carved into the world. Akhenaten does not merely favour one god among many. He reshapes the entire public face of Egyptian religion. The Aten's worship is moved into open sunlight rather than the dark interior mystery of traditional temples. Instead of hidden cult statues served in shadowed sanctuaries, Aten temples emphasize open courts where rays can fall directly on offerings. The king and queen become the central human mediators of divine life. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's great royal wife, appears with extraordinary prominence, sometimes in scenes and roles that approach the visual power of kingship itself. The royal family becomes a theological image the Aten above, rays descending, Akhenaten and Nefertiti receiving and transmitting life, their daughters shown in intimate domestic arrangements beneath the sun. The effect is unlike anything else in Egyptian royal art. The art itself changes so dramatically that it still startles modern viewers. Bodies lengthen, faces become narrow, bellies soften, hips widen, skulls stretch. The royal family is shown with a fluidity and intimacy far removed from the hard perfection of earlier royal images. Scholars still debate what these forms mean. Older theories tried to diagnose Akhenaten with particular medical conditions, but such claims remain uncertain and often go beyond the evidence. Many researchers now treat the style more cautiously, as a deliberate artistic and theological language rather than a medical portrait. The king's unusual body may express transformation, divine uniqueness, fertility, or the collapse of ordinary categories under the Aten's light. No single explanation fully accounts for it, which is why Amarna art remains so magnetic. The most radical move is geographical. Akhenaten leaves Thebes and establishes a new capital at Akhenaten, now known as Amarna, on a stretch of desert plain in Middle Egypt. He presents the site as a place chosen for the Aten, a new horizon unsullied by older cults. Boundary stelae mark the sacred limits. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, workshops, elite houses, and workers' neighbourhoods rise where there had been no ancient capital. It is an astonishing act of royal will, not merely reforming a city, but creating a new sacred landscape almost from the ground up. The move weakens the old power centres, especially Thebes and the priesthood of Amun, and places the court inside a controlled environment built around the king's vision. Yet Amarna is not only a dream of sunlight, it is also a city of labour, heat, dust, bureaucracy, and pressure. Behind the elegant scenes of the royal family under the Aten stand workers quarrying stone, carrying bricks, plastering walls, carving reliefs, preparing food, and sustaining a suddenly created capital in the desert. Archaeology at Amarna reveals houses, streets, workshops, trash, tools, cemeteries, and traces of unequal lives beneath the official radiance. The evidence remains incomplete, and the human experience of the city cannot be reconstructed fully. But what survives suggests that Akhenaten's sacred experiment rested on ordinary bodies and hurried construction. Even a sunlit revolution needs mud brick. The religious policy grows harsher over time. The name and images of Amun are attacked in many places. Older gods are neglected, reduced, or excluded from official favour. Egypt, a civilization that had long absorbed gods into layered relationships rather than simply eliminating them, now witnesses an unusually narrow royal theology. It is tempting to call this monotheism, and some popular retellings do so confidently, but the matter is more complicated. The Aten's supremacy under Akhenaten is real, and official worship becomes intensely focused, but scholars still debate how best to define it. It may be safer to speak of radical Atenism, a royal cult that concentrates divine access through the sun disk and the king, rather than projecting later religious categories too neatly onto the 14th century BCE. Politically, the experiment is dangerous. The empire does not vanish overnight, but royal attention appears to turn inward toward Amarna's theology and court life. The Amarna letters reveal foreign rulers and vassals writing to Egypt with requests, complaints, anxieties, and diplomatic bargaining. These letters are not a complete archive of policy, and they must be read with care, but they show that Egypt's international world continues to demand attention. Vassal rulers in the Levant worry about rivals. Great kings ask for gold and marriages. Akhenaten's revolution may not have caused every later problem, yet it clearly unsettled the balance between religion, court, empire, and tradition. Then comes the fading. Akhenaten dies, and the exact sequence that follows remains one of the most debated puzzles of the late 18th dynasty. There may have been brief reigns, shadowy rulers, and complex royal arrangements involving figures such as Smenkhkar and perhaps Neferuaten. Nefertiti's final role remains uncertain, despite many theories. The evidence is fragmentary, names are damaged, and later restoration efforts deliberately obscured the Amarna period. What is clear is that the Atene experiment does not survive long in its radical form. The old gods return. The court leaves Amarna. The new capital is abandoned, its bright walls left to decay in the desert wind. Tutankhaten, a young royal heir, becomes Tutankhamun, changing his name from the Aten to Amun. That change alone says more than a long proclamation. The restoration is underway. The temples of Amun are revived. Traditional cults regain support. The royal court moves back toward older centers of legitimacy. Tutankhamun is famous today because his tomb survived with extraordinary richness, but in political terms his reign represents repair after disruption. He's not the grand creator of a new age. He's the fragile sign of a country trying to reattach itself to its past. The Amarna shockwave leaves scars because it attacks Egypt's deepest habit continuity. For centuries, pharaohs had changed, dynasties had fallen, foreign rulers had entered, and kingdoms had fragmented. But the gods remained numerous, layered, and ancient. Akhenaten tried to make the sun's visible disk the overwhelming center of divine life, and for a brief moment the entire state bent toward that light. Then Egypt recoiled. Later kings erased Akhenaten's name, dismantled his buildings, reused his blocks, and treated him as a royal interruption. But erasure, once again, failed completely. The ruins of Amarna survive. The strange art survives. The letters survive. Tutankhamun's restored name survives. And in the desert, the abandoned city still catches the sun that Akhenaten once believed had remade the world. After the Amarna shock, Egypt does what it has done before it repairs the visible world. Names are changed back. temples reopen, the gods return to their old places, blocks from Akhenaten's buildings are taken down and reused, their strange Aten scenes hidden inside later walls like a memory Egypt does not want to display but cannot fully destroy. Tutankhamun's short reign helps begin the restoration, but he does not live long enough to define the age after Amarna. Power passes through Ai and then to Horemheb, a soldier king whose rule feels like a deliberate tightening of the state after years of religious and dynastic uncertainty. Horemheb has no royal son to continue his line, but he leaves Egypt with something perhaps more important for the moment order: discipline and a path toward a new dynasty. That path leads to the Ramesside Age, named for a line of kings among whom Ramesses II becomes the great monument maker of Egyptian memory. Before him comes Ramesses I, whose reign is brief, and Seti I, who restores temples, campaigns in the Levant, and gives the dynasty a powerful sense of legitimacy. Seti's art is among the finest of the new kingdom, calm and precise, almost severe in its elegance. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is one of the most beautifully decorated royal tombs ever cut into the Theban cliffs, with underworld books spreading across its walls in rich colour and carefully ordered scenes. The king who enters that tomb is not only a ruler of Egypt, he is a traveller through cosmic night, guided by texts, gods, and ritual knowledge into the rebirth promised to pharaohs since the Pyramid Age, now translated into painted chambers deep inside the mountain. Ramesses II inherits this restored and disciplined world, and then enlarges himself until he seems to stand everywhere. He rules for more than 6 decades, long enough for generations to grow up knowing no other king. His statue appear across Egypt and Nubia. His names fill temple walls. His building projects expand, claim, restore, and sometimes appropriate. At Abu Simbel, colossal seated figures of the king face outward from the rock, guarding the southern frontier with a gaze that is both human and more than human. Twice a year, sunlight reaches deep into the temple's sanctuary, illuminating divine images in a drama of solar alignment that still shapes the modern imagination. Even though the monument's relocation in the 20th century adds another layer to its already complicated afterlife. Ramesses II is often remembered as the warrior of Kadesh, the great battle fought against the Hittites in Syria. Egyptian inscriptions present it as a stunning royal victory, with Ramesses isolated, heroic, and almost superhuman in the face of danger. Hittite and wider historical context make the outcome less simple. The battle was not the effortless triumph Egyptian walls proclaim, and scholars still debate the exact tactical and political results. What matters is how Ramesses uses it. He turns Kadesh into one of the greatest propaganda events of the ancient world, repeated on temple walls so often that the image becomes more durable than the uncertainty. In the royal version, the pharaoh faces chaos and prevails because Amun strengthens him. History may be complicated, but temple relief prefers clarity. Later, Egypt and the Hittite Empire reach a treaty, one of the most famous diplomatic agreements from the ancient world. This is the quieter side of Ramesses' power. The same king who fills stone with martial glory also participates in international diplomacy, royal correspondence, and marriage alliances. The late Bronze Age world is a network of great courts as much as a battlefield. Kings call one another brothers, exchange gifts, negotiate status, and complain when the gold is not generous enough. Ramesses stands inside that world with all the weight of Egypt behind him, but even his reign reveals the limits of monumentality. A king can carve victory into stone, yet still make peace because the political map demands it. His building program also exposes the strange nature of Egyptian memory. Ramesses does not merely build new monuments. He attaches himself to older ones. He restores, reinscribes, adds colossal statues, and places his name where future eyes will see it. To modern viewers, this can look like vanity, and sometimes it was surely close enough. But in Egyptian terms, to inscribe a name is to make presence endure. Ramesses understands that memory must be occupied. If earlier kings built eternity, he colonizes it. His long reign becomes a kind of second landscape laid over Egypt's older sacred geography. Yet after the height comes strain. The later Ramesside period is not an immediate collapse, but the pressures become harder to ignore. The world beyond Egypt changes. Around the eastern Mediterranean, the late Bronze Age system begins to fracture. Cities fall, trade networks weaken, empires struggle, and groups known in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples appear in scenes of conflict and migration. Ramesses III, ruling in the 20th dynasty, presents himself as the defender of Egypt against powerful external threats. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu preserves dramatic images of battles by land and sea, with Egypt framed once again as the last bastion of order against surrounding chaos. The inscriptions are royal propaganda, but they likely reflect real instability in the wider region. No single explanation fully accounts for the late Bronze Age collapse, and Egypt's survival does not mean it escaped unharmed. Under Ramesses III, Egypt still has strength, but the old imperial system is no longer what it was. Resources tighten. Strikes by tomb workers at Deir el-Medina during his reign, or shortly after, reveal an extraordinary glimpse of state stress from below. Workers responsible for royal tombs complain when rations fail to arrive. This is one of the most human details in all Egyptian history. The artisans who carve eternity into the cliffs still need grain, oil, fish, and wages. When the bureaucracy fails them, they stop work. The pharaoh may be divine, but even divine kingship cannot decorate a tomb if the workers are hungry. What survives in the record suggests a state still functioning, but under pressure from economic difficulty, corruption, and administrative strain. The later New Kingdom weakens further as royal authority competes with the rising power of the priesthood of Amun at Thebes. In the south, high priests can behave almost like rulers. In the north, kings rule from delta centers. Egypt does not vanish, but it divides in practice once again, repeating an old pattern with new players. The title of pharaoh survives, the rituals continue, the temples still stand, but the unified power behind them thins. This is one of the great themes of Egyptian history. The image of order often outlives order itself. After the New Kingdom, Egypt enters a long age of foreign and regional dynasties. Libyan-descended rulers take the throne, their families woven into Egyptian society through military settlement, local power, and priestly office. They do not simply replace Egypt with something foreign, they adopt Egyptian kingship, temple patronage, titulary, and ritual forms. Later, Nubian kings from Kush rule as Egypt's 25th dynasty, presenting themselves not as destroyers of Egyptian tradition, but as restorers of ancient piety. Their story is especially important because it reverses the older imperial gaze. Nubia, long pressured by Egyptian expansion, now gives Egypt pharaohs. These Kushite rulers honor Amun, build pyramids in their own southern lands, and revive forms of kingship that they see as deeply legitimate. Egypt's royal idea has become powerful enough to travel beyond Egypt and return wearing a Nubian crown. Then come the Assyrians, whose invasions in the 7th century BCE expose Egypt to the brutal geopolitics of Near Eastern Empire. Cities are taken, rulers flee or submit, and the old security of the Nile Valley is shattered again. The Sate kings of the 26th dynasty restore a measure of native Egyptian rule afterward, looking back toward older artistic forms in a deliberate archaism that makes the past into a political resource. But the world has changed. Persians conquer Egypt in 525 BCE, and although Egyptian revolts and restorations follow, the pharaoh's throne now stands within a much larger imperial contest. Later still, Alexander arrives. The Ptolemies rule from Alexandria, and Cleopatra VII becomes the last famous face of pharaonic power before Rome absorbs Egypt. Through all these transformations, the title, imagery, and sacred grammar of Pharaoh endure with remarkable stubbornness. Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Macedonians, and Romans can all, in different ways, use Egyptian royal forms because those forms still carry power. The office has outlived many dynasties and many ethnic identities, yet something has changed forever. The pharaoh is no longer always the independent center of a Nile-born world. He may be a regional ruler, a restorer, a foreign emperor, a diplomatic symbol, or a priestly image maintained inside temple walls while real power lies elsewhere. The story that began with early graves and rose into pyramids now passes through empire, fragmentation, revival, conquest, and adaptation. Pharaoh does not disappear in one dramatic ending. Pharaoh is transformed, reused, and slowly absorbed into history. The pharaoh's throne does not vanish in a single clean ending. It passes through conquest, translation, imitation, and memory until the living office becomes something else, a subject of temples, museums, laboratories, restoration projects, and careful excavation in the sand. The last rulers who used the old forms could still stand before Egyptian gods in carved relief, still wear crowns shaped by traditions older than most empires, still offer mat to divinities whose names have been spoken for thousands of years. But eventually the temples fall silent, scripts are forgotten, ritual knowledge thins. The old gods are no longer fed each morning in dark sanctuaries. The royal names remain on walls, but for centuries many of them cannot be read. Egypt keeps its monuments, yet the voices inside them become locked away. That silence is never absolute. Local memory, travellers, priests of later faiths, medieval writers, early collectors, and villagers living beside ruins all encounter ancient Egypt in different ways. But the pharaohs as historical figures return slowly, unevenly, through rediscovery. The decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 19th century opens one of the greatest doors in historical study. Suddenly the carved signs are not just mysterious decoration. They are names, titles, prayers, boasts, tax records, king lists, offering formulas, and fragments of human presence. A statue becomes a person again. A cartouche becomes a royal identity. A wall at Karnak becomes not merely beautiful, but readable. The pharaohs begin to speak in their own formal, selective, propagandistic, unforgettable language. Modern archaeology changes them again. Earlier treasure hunting often cared more for spectacular objects than for context, and many losses from those years can never be repaired. But archaeology gradually becomes more disciplined, more scientific, and more attentive to the ordinary traces that surround royal monuments. A tomb is no longer important only because it contains gold. A fragment of painted plaster, a seal impression, a worker's hut, a ceramic jar, a tool mark, a strand of linen, or a layer of flood debris can change the story. The damaged tomb of Thutmose II matters for exactly this reason. It is powerful not because it dazzles the eye, but because it shows how royal burial, ancient disaster, later movement, and modern interpretation meet in one wounded place. The discoveries of recent years make clear that Egypt's ancient royal story remains unfinished. The identification of Thutmose II's tomb in 2025 returns a shadowed 18th dynasty king to the center of attention, not through a perfect burial, but through absence, damage, underworld scenes, and a starry ceiling that survived enough to be read. The tomb of the unknown Abydos dynasty ruler, also announced in 2025, does something different. It reminds us that Egypt's pharaonic past was not only the story of famous kings with long reigns and colossal monuments. Some rulers controlled fractured territories, lived between better-known powers, died with royal claims, and nearly disappeared. Their tombs are not footnotes. They are evidence that kingship could shrink, struggle, and still insist on eternity. Even earlier discoveries, such as the nearly 5,000-year-old tombs reported from Jabal al-Tayr, push the imagination back before the pyramids, to the formative world where burial architecture and elite power were still becoming royal tradition. These tombs matter because they reveal beginnings rather than conclusions. They belong to a time when Egypt was learning how to make authority permanent in earth. Brick, stone, and ritual arrangement, far away in time. They connect to the hidden chambers of the New Kingdom and to the royal tombs that later filled the Western Desert. The forms change, but the desire remains recognizable to make death obey order. Other finds widen the royal story beyond kings themselves. The funerary cache from Heliopolis, with jewellery, cosmetic tools, a bronze mirror, coal vessels, and protective objects, evokes a world of burial belief connected to one of Egypt's great solar centres. Heliopolis, ancient Yunu, was deeply tied to the worship of Ra and to creation theology. Its importance in Egyptian religion is enormous, yet much of the ancient city lies damaged, buried, or absorbed by modern Cairo. A funerary cache there is not simply a collection of objects, it is a small survival from a sacred landscape where solar theology helped shape the deepest claims of kingship. The pharaoh's link to the sun was never an abstract idea floating above Egypt. It was rooted in cities, priesthoods, rituals, and objects placed carefully beside the dead. Science now adds another kind of evidence. The 2025 report of an Old Kingdom genome from Nuweirat shows how even bones can become historical documents, though they must be read cautiously. Ancient DNA from Egypt is difficult to recover, and one individual cannot define a whole civilization. Still, the genetic signal fits a wider truth that archaeology has long suggested Egypt was deeply rooted in North Africa and the Nile Valley, while also connected to neighbouring regions through movement, exchange, and contact. The Pyramid Age was not a sealed chamber. It was part of a living ancient world. The pharaohs ruled a civilization with a strong identity, but that identity grew beside roads, deserts, rivers, and seas that carried people and ideas. The Grand Egyptian Museum gives this long story a new stage. In modern galleries, the royal past is gathered, lit, labelled, conserved, and seen by visitors from across the world. Tutankhamun's treasures, once hidden in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, are presented not as a rumour from the desert, but as a vast collection of craft, theology, politics, and afterlife preparation. Khufu's boat, royal statues, funerary objects. and monuments of many reigns stand within a building that belongs entirely to the present, and yet exists because the ancient Egyptians refused to let death be ordinary. The museum does not replace the desert, it translates it. There is always a danger in that translation. Museums can make the pharaohs seem finished, as if history has been neatly collected behind glass. But the opposite is true. Every object is a survivor of accidents. Every label rests on scholarship that can change. Every royal name carries both knowledge and uncertainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate chronology, identity, cause, motive, and meaning across almost every period of Egyptian history. That uncertainty does not weaken the story, it keeps it alive. The pharaohs wanted eternity, but they received something stranger. They received afterlives in broken tombs, reused blocks, restored paintings, DNA labs, excavation reports, museum halls, satellite images, conservation scaffolds, and quiet debates over damaged inscriptions. Their power is gone, but their questions remain. Who truly unified Egypt? How did early kingship harden into divine rule? What did pyramid workers feel when they saw the monument rise? Why did certain kings vanish while others became immortal in memory? How many tombs still wait beneath limestone, sand, and modern streets? The complete story of Egypt's pharaohs is therefore not complete at all. It is a river with buried branches. It begins before the crowns, rises into pyramids, fractures, restores itself, becomes empire, experiments with the sun, carves victory into stone, weakens, adapts, and finally returns as archaeology. The throne is empty, the temples are ruins, the royal bodies, when they survive, are silent. Yet in the western valleys, in Abydos sand, in Heliopolis soil, and in museum light, the pharaohs continue to do what they always tried to do. They continue to be remembered. The lights soften now over the long river, and the story settles into a quieter shape. The pharaohs no longer need to be imagined only as giants seated in stone, or as names carved above conquered enemies, or as distant figures wrapped in gold and linen. They can be seen more gently, as human beings caught inside an office larger than any one life. They inherited crowns heavy with gods, ancestors, fear, duty, and expectation. Some ruled with brilliance, some ruled briefly and were nearly lost. Some built monuments that still command the horizon. Some left only a broken chamber, a damaged name, or a trace that waits thousands of years for someone to notice. Egypt itself remains the larger presence. The Nile keeps moving, indifferent and generous, as it always has. The desert keeps its silences. The cliffs west of Luxor still gather shadow at evening. At Abydos, the sand still covers more than it reveals. At Giza, the pyramids stand with their stripped stone under the modern sky, no longer white and blazing as they once were, but still impossible to ignore. In Cairo, glass cases and wide halls hold objects that were never meant for museums, objects meant to feed the dead, protect the dead, glorify the dead, and guide the dead through darkness. Time has changed their purpose, but not their force. A coffin becomes evidence, a boat becomes engineering, a scarab becomes propaganda, a tomb becomes a question, a king becomes both person and symbol, both ruler and ruin. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak a name helped keep the dead alive. In a different way, every excavation, every careful restoration, every translated inscription continues that old work. The names are spoken again, not in temple ritual, but in study, memory, and wonder The final image is not a golden mask or a battlefield wall. It is a quiet western valley after the heat has gone out of the stone. The entrance to a tomb lies low in the rock. The sky darkens above it, scattered with the same stars Egyptian artists once painted on royal ceilings. Somewhere inside, the walls still hold fragments of a journey through night. The king is gone, the priests are gone, the empire is gone, but the path remains, leading from darkness toward dawn and Egypt. Patient as the river keeps its secrets a little longer.